Hey guys, it's me, Ethan, aka Blind Justice, aka BJ. I'm sure that's how most of you guys know me. I want to take some time today to talk about a couple things that have been going on for years, but that have recently started coming to light on Twitter about some things that have been going on with Twitch streamers, um, that have been coming out over the last week or so. So I want to start off this video by making it very clear that the people who experience the things that we're going to be talking about today, they deserve justice. They deserve justice for what they've gone through, and I want to make my position on that very clear from the outset. Uh, from my perspective, part of that justice is how we as people outside these situations, how we can be supportive of survivors and how we can engage in a productive way with people on the internet who might take issue or default to skepticism when survivors are sharing these stories. So for those of you who don't know, over the last week or so, a lot of people have started coming forward to talk about some of the experiences they've had with streamers, and that includes streamers outside of the LGBTQIA plus community and even those within the LGBTQIA plus community. And these stories, they range from uncomfortable sexual situations that people have had with streamers to full blatant sexual assault or rape. So, because the experiences that these people have had are so varied, I'm going to be using the term sexual misconduct to talk about what these survivors have experienced throughout this video. And I don't want to do that out of an attempt to sanitize what these people did. And I don't want to try to downplay what these survivors experienced, but I use that term out of a sensitivity and an understanding of the wide range of conduct that we're talking about with respect to these situations. What all of the survivors experienced is serious. It should be treated seriously. And so I really hope the terminology that I'm using today, doesn't detract from that seriousness. So as with the Me Too movements that we've seen that have kind of moved through the old media, the entertainment industry, and to some extent, remain ongoing within those spheres, a lot of these accounts and stories, they're being shared at the same time. People are kind of coming forward en masse and in waves, and since that initial, wave of people came forward to share their stories, more people have done that. Um, and as with other Me Too movements, the Me Too movement that has been kind of going around on Twitter, sharing stories about things that have happened with streamers, involve events that might have occurred a long time ago, months or even years. And so, similarly, um, there are a lot of people who, when they hear about survivor stories, they default and immediately jump to defend the person who's being accused of misconduct. Maybe they're their favorite streamer, or they just can't fathom for some reason that this streamer could do something like that. They want to hear both sides of the story. They want to pick apart. Scrutinize the survivors' accounts. They question the veracity of the accounts and stories that are being told. And I want to be clear that, I think a large portion of these people are probably just, well, I think that a lot of these people are probably just bad actors. They, um, they don't believe the survivors, and they're not going to, because they have some sort of vested interest for whatever reason in their mind, that uh these streamers, um they need to be defended for some reason. But I also believe that a large portion of these people who kind of default to skepticism, they're not bad people, and maybe they mean well. They consider themselves rational because we've been raised in this society that says, well, you're innocent until you're proven guilty, and we need to hear both sides of the story before I can pass judgment and decide who is telling the truth. Um, and so this video is mostly aimed at you if you fall in that camp, but it also is aimed at my friends who see these things happening and want to engage and want to speak out and want to support the survivors in that way and engage with these people and maybe change some minds. So, as a final thought before we get going, I want to be very clear with my intentions for this video and what I hope to accomplish and what I certainly don't intend this video to be. So, ever since these survivors started coming forward to share their stories, I've honestly kind of been at a loss as to what I can do with my means and my limited platform. I mean, I can share tweets, I can show my support that way, but in terms of a material step that I can take in order to support these people who have been brave enough to come forward, I kind of landed on doing this. And so the main point of doing this, the main point of this video is to try to educate, and especially educate on why listening to survivors is so important. And while the direct aim of this video isn't necessarily to elevate a specific story or to share a specific story, because those aren't my stories to tell. I'm not a survivor. I don't have a story to share. But what I can do is I can try to educate all of us on why it's so important to listen beyond just mere compassion. Um, and to encourage you, all of you watching, to do that. And what I'm very adamant about this video not being is an attempt to silence the survivors that have come forward. It's not an attempt to elevate any voices, specifically mine, above the survivors who are brave enough to share their stories. But its purpose is to equip you with some tools and some statistics and some concrete reasons as to why it's so important to listen. And then I hope you go out and do that. My hope is that you walk away from this having learned something, and feeling comfortable enough to speak out against those who are harming survivors online or in real life, whether that's their intention or not. Um, and to support survivors where accountability is lacking. And so in this video, I want to take on two broad but related topics. The first is kind of what we've been talking about already, an attempt to gain an understanding as to why it's important to listen to survivors of sexual misconduct. And I'm going to be talking to some people who are much smarter than me, who know and have experience working with survivors of sexual misconduct, who are familiar with the literature, who have trainings, and through those conversations, I hope to both educate myself and to educate you. And the second related topic is to discuss why, in this specific context, and I do mean this specific context because I don't think that this applies to everything, but the potential damages to survivors in not believing them is always going to outweigh the potential damages to the accused in believing a survivor's story. And more broadly, I think that touches on an oft-raised defense of people who have been accused of sexual misconduct, and that's this concept of cancel culture. Um, and so that's the second topic that I'd like to talk about. And so I hope that we can have productive conversations. I hope this video sparks some conversations and action on your part, and I hope that we can all learn something. Hey, Kevin, thank you so much for agreeing to talk with me. I really appreciate it. If you could just tell everybody kind of who you are and what your background is, and maybe shed some light on maybe any sort of experience that you would have working with survivors of sexual assault or sexual misconduct, and talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So my name is Kevin. I've been a pediatric emergency nurse going on 10 years now. And I've been a sexual assault nurse examiner for the last 4 years. since I work at a children's hospital, I care for victims of acute sexual assault in the emergency department that are under the age of 18. If they're over the age of 18, they head to the hospital across the street, which also has a SANE program, which that we work together with. Um, my relative background with that is in order to get on and become one of the SANEs, we needed to complete over 300 hours of training. We need to do a certain amount of visits with well women, well child. So just like, PCP visits where I would shadow a doctor or physician's assistant nurse practitioner, had to do a certain amount of speculum exams. And then I had to go through a 80-hour training course and then another 2-day course down in Colorado Springs because I live in Denver. And over the last 4 years that I've done this, I looked at my notes and I've cared for about 75 victims of sexual assault in both boys and girls.
And so when you, I mean, I don't, without getting too far in the weeds, and obviously I don't want to be too invasive, but when you are working as a sexual assault nurse, like what kinds of things, I mean, like what kinds of things do you do, like in that capacity?
Since I have that special training and our program is now well known around the state, what I'll do is we've made it a very good program where rather than having the victim tell their story, 3, 4 times to the triage nurse, then to the nurse that's going to go in and see them, then maybe the resident, then maybe the attending, and then a doctor, and then another person going in there. When there's a person that comes in and says, I've been sexually assaulted, I'm complaining of this, bang, we immediately call me in or any other members of my team in who is ever on call that night. And we handle everything. We'll do the basic intake, which is, past medical history, drugs, allergies, things like that, pain. And then we'll do kind of a physical assessment over them to make sure that um, their body's healthy. And then after that, we're trained to do that first to kind of build rapport with our patients. So we're not just like kicking down the door and being like, hey, tell me what happened. And then after that, I kind of explain what my training is and what my specialty is. And I essentially just kind of do very open-ended questions that aren't leading and ask them, what brings you in here today? And then based on what they're telling me, if it's within 5 days, according to the International Association of Forensic Nurses, we can collect seminal fluid and skin cells and things like that after about 5 days. So if the victim tells me that they were sexually assaulted and they were kissed or they were bitten somewhere, I'll do swabs over those areas. I'll take pictures and basically use what they tell me to guide what my exam does. And then I'll also recommend, sexually transmitted infection tests, prep if they're, going to be getting like a pregnancy test. We sometimes will do ELA for like a kind of a plan B. We'll do HIV, hepatitis testing if we feel that the victim or the perpetrator is at a high risk. So those are kind of the things that we'll do. And then we'll do the entire exam. We'll have print out follow-up instructions for them, and then with our program, if we have the time for it, we're able to actually follow up with them in our child protection team clinic on Thursdays.
Sure, which is I guess something that might be a little bit unique to the position that you're in. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, so, with that kind of background and with your training, one of the things that's kind of happening right now, and the purpose that we're having this conversation, and this is something that I shared with you, prior to this discussion, is, there've been a bunch of survivors of sexual assault and misconduct who have come forward, kind of on the internet. A version of Me Too that specifically impacts people on the streaming platform Twitch. Um, and it's a very similar story to what we have seen in old media, in the entertainment industry, stuff like that. And with that kind of mirror image, the same sort of mirror image that we saw during the previous kind of accounts, these watershed moments, people like to question. The first question a lot of times is, if this horrible thing happened to you years ago, potentially, you know, why did you wait to come forward? And also, when all of these things kind of happen at once, and all of these people start coming forward and sharing their stories at once, um,
Mhm.
do you have any, with your experience, do you have any thoughts as to why it would be that multiple accounts generally kind of come forward in waves?
There's a kind of a multitude of reasons why women come forward in groups, and it's because it makes their story more credible. Um, if you look up the facts, they're well known that sexual assaults are historically underreported. According to the Department of Justice, 230 out of every 1,000 sexual assaults is actually reported to police. And so that's one of the reasons. And most perpetrators of sexual assault actually don't face any jail time. According to Rain, out of every 1,000 sexual assaults, 995 will walk away free. So as a victim of sexual assault, you're seeing the constant shame that both women and occasionally men, more to an extent, women are receiving when they come forward with these reports of sexual assault. Sometimes they're often wondering, like, is it even worth coming forward with this information? And another reason that they're coming forward in groups is it's easy to believe someone is guilty if they're of a crime if there are multiple reports of it, because that kind of builds to your character and shows that, hey, this wasn't this like really good guy that was always nice to everybody in the office. Now you see, okay, we've got so many people coming forward that make this person's character evident, and especially if the women um, don't know each other and the stories are very similar in how their attitude, the perpetrator's attitude is, and things like that. And I mean, how many women had to come forward before Bill Cosby was finally charged? From what I looked at, it was somewhere about 60 women. Harvey Weinstein had to have 6 women testify in court. R. Kelly has had dozens of women over the years, and it took a giant documentary to finally take him down. So those are some of the reasons that why, from like the conferences I've been to and just the things that you're looking out at and the experiences that I've had, that's why you see it tend to come forward in waves and not just single people at a time.
And so there are a couple things that you said that I want to touch on. I think so. The first one is, obviously women are not the only people who experience sexual assault or sexual misconduct. Um,
Correct.
my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's even more underreported when the survivor or the person who experienced something is male. And so, like, I don't know that there's really a question there, but I just, we want to be clear that, like, this is not just something that women experience, and that this is something that men experience too. Um, and I don't know. I mean, you mentioned that you had experience working with both male and female patients. And I think the second thing that I want to touch on, and this is more of a question, is, you know, you mentioned multiple accounts kind of lending credibility to each other, kind of symbiotically. Uh, what do you have any knowledge, or is there anything in the literature about the tendency of a person to repeatedly engage in sexual misconduct? I guess like recidivism, kind of.
As far as like the data is kind of it's really hard to get some of the exact data on that because with sexual assault being so underreported, sometimes you're not seeing that this person has had years and years of multiple different events going on their record. It might just be all of a sudden, in the case of like Harvey Weinstein, decades of reports coming forward all at once.
Sure.
Um, from what I've seen, yes, most people, it's if you're a person who sexually assaulted somebody, there's a high rate of recidivism. Um, Again, I haven't looked too deep into the data on that in terms of like what's causing it. Is it we're not doing a good enough job providing them resources after they serve their time in jail, if they actually do, if it's a combination of not seeing criminal results from anything that shows these people that they can just kind of get away with things. But yeah, to go back to your first thing, yes, men definitely are also sexually assaulted. There's common myths that men can't be raped by a woman, especially because it's like, oh, anybody would do that for a girl to sleep with their teacher or sleep with like a professor or something like that. And It's also, yes, very commonly underreported in men, especially if it's men on men, because the when if I'm a heterosexual cis male, like if I'm raped by another man, sometimes there's that stigma that makes me gay because I was raped, or I enjoyed it because I let somebody do it to me. So there's very underreporting. And according to the data too, we see a lot of people actually sexually assaulted in the LGBTQI side much more than their heterosexual counterparts as well.
That's interesting. Um, and okay, so I kind of want to circle back. One of the things that we talked about earlier was, there's like oftentimes a gap in the occurrence um, of something, sexual misconduct, and then the reporting of it, if indeed the person ever does come forward and shares their story. In your experience and knowing what you know and having had your trainings, what are some of the most common reasons why people don't come forward right away, or wait for a long time before sharing their story?
Yeah, sometimes it's a combination of all the things that I'd mentioned, but each case is very unique. Speaking from my experience in these times of like hostility that we're seeing towards immigrants, I've actually had several girls whose parents are undocumented. So they didn't want to come forward because they thought that we would tell the police, then the police would tell ICE, and ICE would come take their parents away. And then the person that did this to them wouldn't get in trouble, so they don't want to report sometimes. So I've seen that happen. Um, so it's hard talking to those victims because you do your best to build this level of trust with them, but the skepticism they have about law enforcement, especially ICE, often causes them to underreport. But um, I mean, from what we're seeing too is about according to the Department of Justice as well, we see about 20% of victims feared retaliation from the perpetrator, because high percentage of rapes are not what we see in Law and Order, SVU, or anything like that, where some random guy on the street picks this woman or man off the street, pulls him into a back alley and rapes him. It's most of the time either a spouse or a significant other or a family relative. So we see that 20% feared retaliation. 13% believed that the police would not do anything to help them at all. 13% believed that it was a personal matter between us. We can solve this without getting the police involved. Um, Others reported it to like a different official, whether it be their psychiatrist, the child victim services, something like that. But the largest number was actually they either gave another reason or they didn't cite one specific reason. They cited multiple reasons as to why they didn't come forward. Um, and this is something that you see especially in people of power, and that's why, going back to that the question you'd asked earlier about why it comes in groups, is sometimes these behaviors go on for decades because you, as your subordinate of your big boss who's making millions of dollars, who's going to believe you, especially with what we're seeing now, the questioning that's coming out and the people saying that they're trying to do this to get famous. So you see it especially in people of power, that's why they're waiting, is until they're like, oh, I've talked to my friend and I've talked to another coworker and another coworker, and they've all said that so and so has done something inappropriate with them in the office, or sent them suggestive emails, or said things like this. And it takes a while to really build that trust amongst these victims to finally come forward with these.
Sure. um so I kind of want to pivot now to kind of one of the reasons why I wanted to talk with you. And I think kind of the heart of the matter is, kind of what you mentioned. There's often times when survivors of sexual assault, or really any sort of misconduct, abuse, whatever, come forward. There's especially when the perpetrator is either a public figure or somebody in some sort of political position, or some sort of position over them in an employment such situation, any of these things. um, they're worried that they're not going to be believed, um, because who is going to listen? Because this,
Hmm.
whoever committed these acts, is somehow a step above them on some sort of ladder. And so, as some of these more prominent cases started coming forward, there was this idea, especially within like liberal circles, um, quote unquote liberal circles,
Yeah.
um, that we need to believe victims. And I'm assuming through your training and because of your job, that is something that you not only agree with, but also have an understanding as to why that's important. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, and the phrase is important for a number of reasons. But the one that really stuck with me was I was at a conference on human trafficking and sexual assault, and a professor from the University of Denver she was presenting, and she compounded interviews of thousands of victims of sexual assault. And she wrote an open-ended question and said, "What would you like the people taking care of you to say?" People put in different answers like, "I'm here to take care of you. Thank you for being here," things like that. But with even with an open-ended question, the majority of women and the small amount of men that she'd also gotten to interview wanted someone to say to them was, "I believe you." The one thing with an open-ended question that they asked for was, "I want you to believe me." So that was one of the biggest things that stuck with me. And as my job as a sexual assault nurse examiner in the emergency department, um, my job is not to prove the other guy guilty or the other woman guilty in the occasions that that occurs. It's to take care of them, and I believe them in that situation. My job is not to get on the stand and say I saw that man, do something, or I believe it was this guy. I say, based on my expertise, I can say acute sexual assault happened or something happened. So my goal is to just take care of the victim and believe them in that situation. So that's why I believe it's a big movement that I think we should get behind.
Do you have any sort of insight, or do you know, and if you don't, that's fine, but like the this flip side, right? Like this thing that happens always whenever somebody comes forward to share their story is, the default setting is to be skeptical. And I guess I can speak anecdotally from things that I have been seeing, on Twitter, like for what that's worth, but of some of these
Hmm.
people who are coming forward and sharing their stories, is like the mental, emotional exhaustion that comes with having to constantly relitigate what happened and constantly defend, not only the veracity of what you're saying, but also like your character essentially for truthfulness. I mean, is there anything in the literature or, statistically, maybe not statistically, but like about what kind of mental and emotional toll or any sort of like real harm that a survivor can experience based on this kind of skeptical mindset?
Well, we see a lot that the literature shows that the skeptical mindset is doing exactly what I kind of mentioned over is where sexual assaults are underreported because of the multitude of reasons. We see that even if I report a sexual assault, 90 some odd percent of those people aren't even going to face any jail time. If you're going up against somebody in a position of power, anecdotally, you can see that when Biden got the assault allegations against him, it was a wave of, well, she wanted something in power. She didn't say things for years, and people attacked her character. Same thing happened when people came forward on Donald Trump and on Bill Clinton and these people of power. We immediately go to attacking their characters. That sets the skeptical mindset of not believing these people. Immediately makes them sometimes not want to report, as we've seen. The data also shows that sometimes when they do report, they don't want to go through with these cases. They don't want to pursue charges because of how much public pressure they're getting put on them. And the skeptical mindset not only affects the victim, but if you look at the literature out there, the groups that are often affected the most by these false rape myths and skepticism and these belief myths are actually law enforcement, and that sometimes with the data that we see is very skewed because some of the data that we see is um, reported as a false report because the victim didn't want to go forward. So when we see the skeptical mindset, that's what's pushing people towards that is they don't want to come forward because everybody's just going to question what happened anyway.
That's a really interesting point, and you actually touched on something that is another kind of touchstone for people who want to. I don't want to say like delegitimize the stories, but for
Hmm.
people who for one reason or another are not inclined to believe a survivor story, and that is, I believe the term you use is like rape myth. And so, can you talk a little bit more about that and what we know from like a academic standpoint about that?
Yeah, so far too often we hear these stories in the news about somebody falsely accusing another person of rape, and it makes national headlines because it's something that happens so few that it makes national headlines. And I mean, what we see, especially if you're on the lovely website Twitter, is that gives these people the right when they see this story that so and so's sexual assault was actually fabricated. They go, see, we shouldn't believe everyone. And these stories actually have effects on people's perceptions. And a study that I recommend that you read is it's called Police Officer Schema of Sexual Assault Reports, Real Rape, Ambiguous Cases, and False Reports. It's by Dr. Rachel Venema. Goes over a lot of reasons about why these false report myths and rape myths are things, and it goes over what's considered legitimate rape, not legitimate rape, and vehemently false, I believe is what the article describes. So I can't go over everything like that unless you want to spend another hour here
Sure. No, that's
discussing a very boring statistic analysis. But um, from the literature that you look at in terms of false reporting, it varies, but you can see anywhere from as low as 2% to as high as 10%, depending on the study that you look at. But the exact number is incredibly hard to predict because accurately, because of the prevalence of the underreporting. Like I'd mentioned before, police filing a report where the victim chooses not to pursue charges as either a false report or not a credible report, and the difficulty of accumulating this data from people.
sure. That makes a lot of sense. Um, I mean, I struggle with it because oftentimes when people want to talk about that, there's truly nothing, you can say. You can point to the statistics and you can say, look, the numbers that I've seen are 2 to 8%. That's what I've been seeing on around, and it
Yeah.
sounds like that's fairly in line with what you're saying. But like, if I mean, what uh, so my understanding is that like even though these are, you know, even though they're not a super high percentage, they still have a disproportionate impact in the way that people think about these things. Is like, what can we do? Do you have any ideas or suggestions about if I wanted to engage with somebody like that, and especially somebody who has like anecdotal evidence of, well, this happened to my so and so, like my ex girlfriend's brother's dad or something like that. Well, that's just their ex girlfriend's dad, but
Yeah.
yeah. If like, what can we say to somebody like that? I mean, is there anything that we can say?
It's tough to say because a lot of people are sometimes there's people that whose minds you will not change no matter what. You're like, here is literally a video of this happening, and they're like, this, you don't see the whole entire video. So it's hard with those people, and it's hard to tell who those people are going to be. Um, to those people that are very skeptical or sometimes playing the devil's advocate, where they're like, well, I just want to make sure we're checking the other side. Um, Things that I can say is like, look, but I feel that we should believe them initially because of all the things that I just went over with. I mean, I'm a very data analysis driven person, and then I kind of use stories as well to go with that. The victims, especially some of the men that or boys that I've cared for in my times as a sexual assault nurse, have been the stories are horrifying for them to tell, and it's horrifying for them to retell. So constantly making the person, retell all these details, retell like in exact detail of every single thing that happened, it makes it so difficult for those people. So I advise everybody just be a compassionate ear, take some time to listen to what comes out about it, but don't start jumping to the immediately, what were you wearing, what were you doing, how much did you have to drink, have you had sex with this person before, things like that. And just believe the victim to start, listen to their story, and just be a compassionate person there for them.
Yeah. Um And I think that that's a good. I mean, that's the advice, right? Like if you had to give advice to somebody who was trying to engage, or not even engage, but wanted to be a compassionate observer of and supporter of what is going on right now, these kind of watershed moments in our culture, um, that's what it would be.
Yeah, it's be compassionate and take the time to listen to that person, especially if you're a friend of that person. I know it can be tough too if your best friend is this guy and he's accused of sexual assault from his girlfriend or his boyfriend or significant other. It's tough to pick sides because you're essentially drawn into that. You either believe this person or believe this person. Um, but I kind of always default to the victim because it's so tough for these people to come forward with things that the we when you're dealing with them, it's rarely that we see. I think that the data that we'd mentioned, the 2 to 8%, I think it's vastly under that because of the amount of underreporting of sexual assault that we're getting. But yeah, I would just say believe them, be a compassionate ear, and don't try and play the devil's advocate, and don't really dive into this person's history or anything like that. Just be a compassionate listening person, tell them that you believe them, and let it play out from there.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much for giving me your time and for giving me your insights. Is there anything
Yeah.
else that we haven't gotten to talk about that you think is important when we're talking about these subjects?
I think one thing is the biggest thing that I've seen, especially when I was working in the legislature here about Title IX protections in college sexual assault reporting, is bringing up this deal of consent, where you may have had sex with this person before, or you may have had a lot to drink and said at the bar, like, yes, I want to sleep with you, or you were wearing something seductive, or things like that. One of the big, we always lay blame on the victim when we're asking these questions. And one of my college professors, who taught my human sexuality class, she once said, "The man or woman can line up 100 people and have sex with each and one of them, one after another. That does not give you the right to have sex with them if they did not give you consent." So I always try and push consent, and I'm actually working at the some school programs here on discussing things like consent, and bringing up these tough topics of like, well, what if he or she is drunk and you take them home and you had agreed to having sex that night? Is it okay? And the answer is no. Um, if they had had sex with you before, do you have the right to have sex with them? I bring up these questions with freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors, and we identify leaders, and then we have those leaders then go into the schools and kind of help kind of dispel some of those myths. So yeah, just bringing up the talk of consent, and I know it might kill the mood or whatever if you're with somebody, but always make sure, like, are you sure you want to do this? Are we consenting to engage in this act?
Okay. Well, Kevin, first of all, like I said, thank you for taking the time to talk with me. And also thank you so much for the work that you do. It's really important. Um, and I appreciate it. Uh, yeah, I think that's it. Hi, Laura. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk with me. I really appreciate it. If you could just really quick take a couple seconds to introduce yourself and maybe give just a little bit of background about your knowledge of some of the issues that we're talking about, and your background with that as well.
Sure. So, as you said, I'm Laura. In the gaming community, I'm known as Mrs. Flowcrow through my husband who games as well. And so I'm chatting a little bit about this with BJ because my background is I am currently doing my master's in counseling psychology. Prior to that, I spent 10 years working in a maximum security prison. And prior to that, I myself was or am a survivor of child sexual abuse. So I have a real connection to this sort of conversation and come at it from a lot of different perspectives.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for coming and sharing your experience with us. So, I don't know, how plugged into everything you are, but as somebody who's on Twitch and intimately close with somebody who also streams, there's kind of this Twitch is experiencing a version of Me Too right now,
Mhm.
where a lot of people who have experienced sexual misconduct, specifically involving a streamer, are kind of coming forward with their stories and sharing it.
Mhm.
And we're world citizens. We watch the news. This is obviously kind of mirroring other Me Too movements that have happened in other types of media, and that are still ongoing to a large extent. Um, one of the kind of hallmarks of these types of movements is waves of people come forward to
Mhm.
tell their stories at the same time. Do you have any insight as to like
Why
why
that
these
happens?
watersheds happen? Yeah,
Yeah, for sure. I think in the beginning, for a lot of people, it's terrifying to come forward. It's a very, very vulnerable thing for somebody who has been through sexual misconduct to come forward and tell their story. And there's a lot of reasons behind that that we'll get into. But I think why you see sort of that domino effect of it's like nobody spoke, and then all of the sudden one person talks and the dominoes start to fall is there's power in numbers, right? So if you have one person who's really brave that comes forward who says, "This happens to me," you're going to have a whole bunch of people in the background that go, "Oh my gosh, me too." And that's kind of where the name of the Me Too movement came from. So
sure.
they go, "Wow, I'm not alone. Like it's not just me." And okay, there's two of us. So, I have support. I'm not going to be called out as being this one person who's saying this, that, well, that never happens in this community because somebody's already said it's happened. So there's already a level of being validated when somebody comes forward. And there's maybe a little bit more confidence that maybe this will be taken seriously. Maybe I'll be believed. And as you see, two women come forward, then it becomes this exponential growth because four women come forward, eight women come forward, or men, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Whoever comes forward, it creates this safety net around you going, okay, we're all together. It's kind of that, I don't want to say it's that gang mentality, but it's definitely there's power in numbers. And sometimes people don't know that they can come forward until somebody does come forward. So sometimes people believe, if you see me looking down, I made some notes here. So
Oh no,
just,
that's completely
it's not
fine.
like, what is she doing? Um, no, sometimes people don't know that they can come forward. Sometimes people are victimized by somebody who's in a position of power. So I don't know a ton about what's happened in the Twitch community, but if you have a much more powerful streamer who's come forward, somebody who has a lot of followers, it's really difficult to speak out against that person. And you go, well, can I? And so if somebody else did already, it's like, okay, maybe I can too. So
Mm-hmm.
I think it really just falls around that feeling of support and that feeling of being validated in what you're feeling. Because sometimes people question whether or not even what happened to them was wrong. And so if you hear somebody talk about it, you go, "Oh, like that wasn't okay?" So I think that that's what creates a little bit of that sort of domino effect when you see
Yeah.
a lot of people come forward at the same time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I
Yeah.
mean, I think that like, one of the things that people get concerned about when like all of these accounts start being told at the same time is like, well, people are just piling on now. They're just using this
Mhm.
as an excuse to what, get revenge or bring up something,
Yeah.
that dig up something that's years old to try to, I don't know, get this person in trouble or whatever. But
Mhm.
what you said makes a lot of sense. But I think it also, like we were just talking about, touches on this other thing, and it's something that you mentioned as well, is um there are reasons why people wait to
For
come
sure.
forward. Can you talk a little bit more about those?
Yeah, there's for every survivor out there, there's 10 reasons why they don't come forward. So for everybody, it's different. So for anybody watching this, I don't want them to think that what I'm saying is exclusively a list of why people don't come forward. But some of the stuff that I thought of that's really general is there's fear. There's a fear of not being believed. There's a lot of systemic issues as to why people don't come forward as well. The justice system does not support victims of sexual assault, sexual abuse, sexual misconduct. It's not a system that's supportive. Oftentimes, from the moment of reporting, victims are blamed. You'll hear questions like, "What did you do? What could you have done that caused this? Um, were you drinking? Did you say yes? Did you?" There's questions like that, and so there's this immediate blaming of victims that creates a lot of fear for people, and it's really hard to stand up against, especially if you're getting it from the police. There's actually currently a thread going around Facebook and Instagram right now of things that judges have said to victims during sentencing.
I've seen that.
Reasons why offenders have gotten lighter sentences. And I can say myself, going through the court system, that that's not false. Even as a child, you have people coming, or the perpetrators of these crimes going, well, they wanted it, or they didn't say no. And sometimes, when you have that power differential, you can't say no.
Mm-hmm.
So that stops people. And then you run into sort of the shame and the guilt around this type of crime. And so the difference between shame and guilt is guilt kind of surrounds the I made a mistake. Shame is I am a mistake. And so there's guilt around not stopping it, not speaking out, not understanding what consent is, not knowing if it was an assault or not, was it my fault, things like that. And where shame comes in is when somebody starts internalizing those feelings of guilt and blaming themselves, going, I should have done this, I should have done that, I should have done more to stop it. And they really internalize those feelings, and they don't want to come forward because then it really does feel like it's their fault. And then when you run into the gaming community, correct me if I'm wrong here, but streaming and gaming is still very male dominated. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So there's a level of misogyny in the gaming community where it's kind of a boys' club, right? And so you take that. So women, or people who don't fit into sort of that mold of what a gamer is, feel like they already don't fit in, and that they might be ganged up on if they come forward. This is also, the gaming community is also a safe place for a lot of people. If your outside world is not very safe for you, gaming sometimes is an outlet for people. So there's a lot of fear around losing your safe place.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
And yeah, if you come forward and say, hey, this happened to me in this community, and you think that people are going to go, you liar, you horrible person, you whatever it is, you've just lost your only safe place. And so I think that puts a different layer on it that you don't see in other communities necessarily. And that's kind of a systemic thing within gaming as well. And gaming, I've witnessed it myself just watching. It can be very toxic. There's that
Never experienced that before.
Right? No, nobody's experienced that, right? So many people have experienced that just by, you did something wrong in a game, and it's like, I'm gonna come kill your family. Like, I've literally seen that, and I'm just like, wow, like, that's insane. But there's a level of protection that the screen gives people to say things that they wouldn't say to your face, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so there's a level of abuse that people who come forward are opening themselves up to, because it's going to happen. Because not only, if a victim comes forward, let's say in the real world, people have to speak directly to them to say, you're a liar, you horrible person. Now, take away having to talk to somebody's face and being able to stay anonymous when you say this to these victims, and say, you can say whatever you want and they don't know who you are. And so that puts another, again, power differential in play, and it puts more fear in play as to why you wouldn't want to come forward, because it's a scary thing. And if you're coming forward against somebody who's a big gamer, or somebody who's known in the community, you're a little fish, right? So that's a really scary thing for people to do.
Yeah, and I mean, and even, some of the stories that people are sharing are, I was trying to break into, this person's circle of friends because
Ah,
they have a lot of social clout, they have a lot of power on
hmm.
Twitch, and I felt like if I had said anything at this time, I would have disrupted my chances of
Yeah, you lose your opportunity.
yeah, and like
Hmm.
it has to be so like the amount of pressure to not say anything. I mean, that has to have some sort of impact as well too. Like you,
Yeah.
when if you're very materially scared for the potential to have a career in this,
Hmm.
or like you said, being ostracized from a place that you
Yeah.
feel safe or you feel like you
Yeah.
belong, at least for at least until you do something and step out of line. um
Yeah.
yeah, that's a terrifying that's a terrifying
Yeah.
thought. um
It's a scary thing to give up, you know, what you think might be your future. There's lucrative opportunities in gaming, right? And so if you feel like you have an into that, to go against the person who has control over your opportunity is you're giving up more than um, there's embarrassment and shame around it, but you're giving up more than that. You're literally giving it all up to come forward. And that's a hard thing to do. That's a very hard thing to do.
mhm. I mean, and I think that, that's, I think, something that we've seen, kind of across the spectrum, um, not only on Twitch, but also, just in the kind of wider Me Too movements that we've seen in corporate
Mhm.
cultures, in the entertainment industry, people being branded, they're a troublemaker, they cause too many problems, they're hard to work with, all of these things. I mean, I have to imagine that as somebody is making the decision, potentially to come forward, like that has to be just on the
Mhm.
forefront of your mind. Like, what am
Well,
I about to do?
and I can speak personally to that. Um, in my career with corrections, the reason my career came to an end is because I'm somebody who came forward. And I came forward about things that were happening in the corrections environment, that were illegal, that were immoral, that were so many things. And in doing that, it made it so unsafe for me to return to work that they are paying me to be re-educated and to move into a different career because I can't return. And I knew when I came forward that that was going to be the result. Like there was no going back when I decided to be a witness to these things. And so there's not very many people who will come forward and do that, and it's really hard to ask somebody to come forward and do that, right? When they could lose everything.
Mm-hmm.
And so people have to be prepared to do that, and that's a scary thing.
Yeah, yeah, that
Yeah.
sounds absolutely terrifying. Well, we need more people like you. I think in this world, it sounds like,
Well,
um, but and I think that kind of ties into this, mantra, um, in some way that we have in like liberal or like leftist circles, where it's like,
mhm.
we need to believe victims,
Yes.
and it's for all of these reasons, right? Because
Yeah.
of all of the risks that they're taking and coming forward. The can you speak a little bit more to like the like mental health aspect of like
Yeah.
what it feels like, what it means to come forward, and b what
Mhm.
kind of impacts it can have if you talked about these
You're not
questions that
believed.
people always get.
Mhm.
What did you do to essentially deserve this? What were you doing that made them think that this was okay? Did you ask for it? Like all of these things. Like, can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so all of it surrounds trauma. And so the incident itself is a trauma, right? So somebody goes through trauma. A lot of things can result from trauma. There's an impact on the person, whether it can go as big as PTSD, it can be as small as somebody going, okay, I'm going to brush it off, I'm okay. Everybody deals with trauma differently and has different resilience levels. But you have the initial trauma. Now, when somebody comes forward, they're re traumatized just by having to tell their story and relive their story. Now, add on top of that being questioned as to whether or not you're telling the truth or if it's your fault. Again, there's another level of trauma there. And it just continues to build on these different levels of trauma. And there's fear associated with that as well. Um, when you talk about not being supported as a victim in the justice system, in the media, in your community, it's just constantly re-traumatizing the victim. So you're constantly having to relive this moment in time, whether it was yesterday, 2 weeks ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. It constantly brings up those feelings. So liken it to a car accident, right? So you get badly rear-ended and you get smoked. Okay, so that hurts, right? You've got whiplash, maybe you hit your face on the steering wheel, the airbag went off. Okay, just as you're taking a breath from that rear end, somebody comes and blindsides your car and you get hit again. Just as you're going to get out of your car, somebody hits you from the other side. So that's kind of what's happening internally for victims of assault when they come forward, when they're constantly being questioned. And so it's just that re-traumatization process that you never recuperate from. And you've got to think, from that car accident analogy, there's more damage happening every time, right? So you can't recover from that, and being able to pull yourself out of that, it's just like every time you turn around, if you're being questioned, you start to question yourself. And so it just gets more and more and more difficult from that respect.
And it sounds like, from what you just said, like that re-traumatization, it doesn't lessen, the more remote in time the
No.
initial trauma was. I mean, it stays constant.
Yeah. And if anything, for some people, the longer they don't deal with it or they don't talk about it, it's sort of that wound festers. It's like an infection, right? And it grows. And for some people, they're able to kind of block it off and put it in a box, but eventually that box gets too small, right? And it all comes spilling out. And so, yeah, it doesn't lessen over time. If anything, it's going to get worse over time for a lot of people, especially if they're wanting to come forward and they haven't and they aren't sure why. And there's just all these constant questions. And as long as you're not dealing with it, it doesn't hurt. But as soon as you kind of crack that lid off Pandora's box, it's open, right?
Sure.
And it's really hard to put it back in.
Sure.
Yeah, really hard to put it back in.
One of the other things that people like to hand wring about a lot, when these types of things happen is, okay, well, what if this person who is coming forward is just making all of this up? And
For
they're
sure.
trying to get this person in trouble. They're jealous of their success, out of revenge for some sort of personal slight. Can you talk to us a little bit more about, the statistical likelihood of that being true, and like what our internal response should be, and what we should say to people who are trying to like raise that as a defense. Like, what can we
Yeah.
say?
That's something you hear. And I mean, what I will say is false accusations when it comes to sexual assault and sexual misconduct are exceedingly rare. They are very rare from a statistical standpoint. Somewhere like around 2% of all cases that come forward are false accusations. That's not to say that they don't happen, because 2% is a number, right?
Right.
But the vast majority of people who are coming forward are telling the truth. They're not lying about this. They're not looking to get attention from this. Because really, when you think about it, the attention that comes from this is not positive. It's really difficult to go through. Now, that being said, you need to believe victims. Okay, so you need to take it seriously when somebody comes forward. So when somebody says, well, what if they're making a false accusation? Okay, what if they are? So if they're making a false accusation, then it needs to be investigated. And I think that's the case across the board. Now, we had talked about this a little bit earlier about the pendulum swing. So in the past, the pendulum's been way over here, where it's 100% you're innocent until proven guilty beyond a shadow of a doubt. We need physical proof. It has to be like, lock and key, and 100% we have no doubt. That is virtually impossible in these cases. So what's happened with the Me Too movement is the pendulum's come and it's swung over here, where we go, every person who comes forward is 100% telling the truth, and we need to just gutter all these people that they're making accusations against. We need to shut down their lives. We need to throw them in prison. We need to do all of this. That's not taking into account the fact that there could be a false accusation. It's possible. So we kind of need to come back over here somewhere where we say, we take you seriously. We believe that something happened, and we are going to investigate it and look into it. And we're going to have systems in place that protect you when that happens. So what that means is, if you're thinking of a workplace where it's a workplace accusation, we're not going to have the person who's being accused. We're not going to have their boss do the investigation. We're going to have an external source come in and do the investigation. But we're going to believe you, and we're going to treat you as though you're telling the truth, because that's truly what needs to happen. You can't come to somebody and the first question be like, "Are you sure?"
Right.
Like
Right.
it right? Like it's kind of like, wow, okay, like are you sure that he murdered that person? Like, we believe people who come forward, but we do some due diligence to make sure that it's not a completely erroneous claim, right?
Right. So I mean, it
So,
sounds like we can believe victims, or survivors. We can believe them, but still, in with that belief, account for the fact that there's a small statistical, you know,
mhm,
percentage of these cases, that don't end up being true. And my understanding is that
yeah,
that statistic can also be influenced by things not meeting like legal definitions of
mhm,
things. The I talked with somebody who talked about the idea that if somebody decides not to press charges, sometimes that's reported by the police as a false accusation. And so
yeah,
like obviously there's some wiggle room on both sides of this too, because
there is.
a lot
Yep.
of cases go unreported as well. um and
Well, and
so
I'll tell you, like, I know the statistics from child sexual abuse. 95% of cases in child sexual abuse go unreported. So you're literally looking at 5% of the cases. So
sure.
expand that and extrapolate that. And like you said, a vast majority of cases go unreported. This is the most unreported crime is sexual abuse and sexual misconduct. For sure.
And just to be clear, when we're talking about reports, we're talking about like reports to law enforcement or some sort of like uh political apparatus. Is that right? Or does that encompass reports to like a mandatory reporter or something like that?
To anybody.
So I mean,
That
yes, it's like a really sad
it's a scary
statistic.
statistic.
Yeah,
It's
it's
really sad.
super
Yeah.
scary. But so I guess my point is that we can account for the idea that in some, who knows what the exact percentage is,
Mhm.
case where maybe somebody is actually fabricating something, we can still
Mhm.
account for the idea that we need to believe people and be compassionate through
Absolutely.
that
Yeah.
process.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very much it's a support, right? It's saying, "Okay, like I believe you. Let's move forward and see what we can do."
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's I'm there for you. What do you need from me? Right? So that's what it means to believe a survivor or to believe a victim. It's saying looking at them and going, "I believe you." That's not carte blanche to throw everybody in jail. It's not, right? But it's literally saying, "I'm here with you. I'm going to walk with you.
Mm-hmm.
Like, let's do this together." You know what I mean?
Right. And I mean, to the extent that nothing ever comes of it, there are no repercussions or anything. I
Mhm.
mean, that's still the right response, right? Like,
Absolutely.
say no
Yeah.
investigation ever happens, that's still the right response.
It is. Yeah, I would absolutely agree with you on that.
Um, and so, one of the things that I like that I want to do with this video is educate and talk about concrete steps. And
Mhm.
so, as just kind of like a wrap up question, when we see all of these people, especially on social media, because it's so different from somebody, from a close friend or somebody coming to you and saying, I have something to share with you. um
Mhm.
Especially when people are doing this very publicly on social media, what does a compassionate response from me, who doesn't know either of these people,
Yeah.
or who wants to show my support for survivors of sexual misconduct,
Mhm.
what does that look like?
That's a tough one. I really think that's, you know, if you're gonna reach out and say something, saying them, I'm so sorry that happened to you. I'm so sorry you're going through this. Um, I hope you have the support you need. I hope the people around you are supporting you, but I'm sorry you're going through this. It's as simple as that. It's just, and that literally says, I stand with you.
Mm-hmm.
And you can say that to them, I'm sorry you're going through this. I stand with you. You're not alone. So I think that's really a way to support people. It's just, you know, whatever they're going through, it's like, I'm sorry. Like it's hard.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
it's
But I
just
stand with you. I'm with you.
it's um it's been like a really like intense cultural reckoning that is happening right
For
now.
sure.
And
Yeah.
we I want myself certainly, but also my friends and my community, and all of our communities really to stand on the right side of it. Um,
Absolutely.
and so I really appreciate you taking the time to talk. Are there
Yeah.
any is there anything about like these topics or your experiences or your story that you want to talk about that we haven't covered?
No, I think you've covered it. I think people just need to really remember how difficult it is to come forward. It's very easy as somebody sort of on the sidelines to sit back and armchair quarterback this and say, well, you should have come forward, or why didn't you come forward? And we've really touched on a lot of the reasons why people don't come forward, but we can't um, take somebody's external behavior and internalize it and say, we know what they were thinking. And
Mm-hmm.
so people really need to take a step back and say, what? I don't know what else is happening in that person's life that stopped them from coming forward, but it's not my place to judge,
Right, and we shouldn't
right? Like it's
care.
no, it doesn't matter. And so it's never our place to judge somebody else's response to trauma, right? So even if you've been there, I personally cannot sit back and judge somebody else who was abused as a child. I can't sit back and judge somebody who went through harassment in the workplace and their response to it. We can't ever say we know what it's like to be in somebody else's shoes. And so I think we really need to step back and just come at it from a place of compassion and say, I don't know what you're going through because I don't. I'm not you, right? But I'm with you and I care about you and I'm sorry you're going through it. Like, I think we just really have to, and all of that encompasses, even if you're somebody who's like, well, maybe, what if they're not telling the truth? It's still, I'm sorry you're going through this. It must be really hard because no matter what, it's really hard.
Right.
So we
Right.
just really need to come at it from a place of compassion.
Well, thank you so much for your insights, for your thoughts, and for the good work that you're doing and are going to do. I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me so much. It's really been a pleasure. Hi, Sammy. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk with me. I really appreciate it. I hope that you're having a good night. And for those of you who don't know who Sammy is also a streamer on Twitch. Could you just give us a short introduction, sis, and talk a little bit maybe about your relevant experience working with survivors of sexual assault or misconduct? And maybe tell us a little bit more about your experience on Twitch as well.
Yeah. Well, hi everyone. I'm Simple Sammy. I am an LGBTQI plus content creator on Twitch. And I appreciate you inviting me on this podcast or this video. I really appreciate you wanting to hear what I have to say and what I bring to the table. For those that don't know what I bring to the table, I actually work on 3 different lines. I do 2 phone lines. One is a suicide hotline, another one is a crisis and distress line. And both of those hotlines have very specific things with regards to domestic abuse, sexual harassment. I have to deal with survivors, not deal with, but I talk to a lot of survivors uh, all the time and listen to what they're going through. And I work on another text line that is specific to women fleeing abuse. So domestic violence, sexual violence, uh, any sort of assault, abuse, you name it. That's what we do at that establishment, and I've been trained for it. It's something I do as on a volunteer basis. Um, and it's super challenging because, as y'all can tell, I am a male presenting individual, and it's really hard to build that kind of rapport with all these women who are fleeing abuse. And but it's still, as weird as it sounds, it's rewarding to know that I'm helping individuals, but it's also sad that this type of support system is necessary because of all the evils that are still going on in the world.
Sure. I'm actually really glad that I would get to talk to you. Well, because you're my sis, but also because you know, you're the only person that I'm going to be talking to that is also a streamer.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously sexual assault and misconduct are bigger issues that impact society, not just within the US and Canada, but obviously across the entire world. But kind of the catalyst for what's going on right now has been all of these people coming forward and sharing their stories about specifically streamers, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't know about you, but I've just like it's been so difficult for me to like deal personally with this kind of reckoning that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
um I like one of the first things that I actually saw was somebody that one of the first people that I ever watched on Twitch back before I even like really knew what Twitch was. They were one of the people that got caught up kind of in the crossfire, and it was
Mm-hmm.
just really weird for me to like see this person who I felt like I had watched and
Yeah.
kind of like knew. And like that's kind of where these things are coming from now. And there have been a lot of people who have been implicated, but recently, and I'm sure you saw this, Twitch started issuing bans.
Mm-hmm.
um what do you think about Twitch's response so far?
Well, I think that Twitch having a response is a good thing. I will say though that when abusers come out and admit what they've done and apologize for it, Twitch reprimanding them is important. But Twitch should also look into the abusers who are not admitting guilt and figure this out, because it's it's not it feels like, for a lot of survivors of this, it feels like that if your abuser doesn't admit it, and it's this is the impression that Twitch is even giving. If you don't admit it, you're not going to get reprimanded for it. And so people who are admitting it, getting reprimanded for them, they are doing now, even though they've done terrible things, they're trying to do something right, which is admit it and apologize for their actions. They're getting reprimanded for it. And the folks that aren't are still being, at this point right now, we don't know what's going to happen in the future, but are still being rewarded with their voices on their platform, being partnered, their sponsorships, the list goes on. And it's not okay, and it's not cool. But at least Twitch has given a response. I think that the next point is to really sift through everything that's going on social media right now, and talk to the survivors of these horrendous acts, and get more details. Or if they're an establishment, you're a corporation, just cut ties from these partners. It's not like it's 50% of the partners on the platform. It's, even though it may be, but you should still cut that tie with them, at least in my opinion. But it's a tough situation to be in because you know
Right, like Twitch isn't a governmental arm. It's not
Mhm.
like a law enforcement agency. um I, it's so hard to I agree with you. Like I think that it's really really shitty that simply by staying silent, some of these people who have done these horrible things are just going to sit there and enjoy their subs and enjoy their money and continue to get people watching them and supporting them. It's just so hard to know like what what a response from Twitch should look like for people who aren't going to admit to something. Um,
Yeah.
but that's above both of our pay grades. But
Exactly.
but but as another streamer, I do appreciate like your insight and
Yeah.
perspective on that.
What I
Um,
will say to this though, just to like, even though we're both, it's above both of our pay grades, I think it's still important as a viewer, as a community member, as anybody who likes to go on Twitch as a media platform, look at these lists and figure out who you are supporting. Who are you giving your money to? Granted, they may not be coming out and admitting it. They're not going to get reprimanded by Twitch, but you can still affect their pocket. If you don't like what's going on and you want to choose to believe the survivor, don't watch that streamer. Don't sub to that streamer. Don't engage in their posts. Don't, allow them to get away with it. Um, you don't have to be at the forefront of the fight and do a whole post and start this. You don't have to do that, but you can start by just simply doing those things I just mentioned, not watching them, not giving them your money, and saying that I stand with the survivor. If Twitch isn't going to do it as a corporation, then Twitch as a community should take it in their own hands.
right, and that's like a really good point, right? Because as streamers, and for those of you who don't stream, um, who if you don't know, as streamers, I don't. I certainly don't make a lot of money. But like we make the money that we make is based off of subscribers and bits and like partnerships with brands and stuff like that. And so, the part that you can have control over is like the platform that
Yeah.
we give these people. Um and I think that the first step in kind of what you said is like listening to survivors tell their stories and believing them. And that's kind of like the entire point of what I want to talk about, and why I think it's important to make this video, because you've seen the tweets, right? And you've seen the people's responses when people come
Yeah.
forward. Can you just give me some thoughts about based on your experiences, like why it's so important for that to be the first step in taking direct action?
Which step?
Just like listening and believing.
Okay, so the first thing that we always can do as people who are not, in the situation is believe the survivor, believe what's going on. Because when you believe a survivor, and this is what happens on my lines as well, when you believe them, you allow them to further, they one feel safe and heard. Two, you further allow them to talk about what's going on, and so that gives you, in a legal perspective, more evidence, because you're walking in a little bit unbiased, because I guess you are biased to their belief. If you're biased to believing someone, you're going to be more prone and tuned in to seeing red flags and things, versus if you just don't believe them from the get-go, because then you're not going to be tuned in to, listening to what their evidence is. So number one, you have to create that safe space. So by believing them and saying, I hear what you're saying and I believe you, you're creating that safe space of them being accepted, and you're lessening that pressure that they had to admit what they've been through, which is devastating for people. People don't realize that sexual assault and domestic assault and all these types of assaults and abuse affect people's mental health and result in so many things, such as suicide, self-harm, uh, trauma that they have to deal with for the rest of their life through psychotherapy. It's not just like, oh, it happened to me and like accept. It's so much deeper than that. And by accepting them and believing them, we alleviate these other issues with trauma, suicide, self-harm, because it makes them feel like, oh my gosh, people believe me and it wasn't my fault. And that's why it's important to do that. Because we're not here to, you know, soften the blow for the abuser. We're here to soften the blow to the abusee. We're here to help them so that it doesn't hurt them as much. Why would we not want to accept what they have to say? And why would we not want to believe them and make their lives worse just so that we can make the lives of the abuser better? I don't see how that would make any sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, one of the refrains that I'm sure you've seen and that I've been seeing is like, well, we don't know what happened. So we want to get both sides of the story before we pass judgment, because we don't want to materially affect, this person's life, potentially, the accused's life, if we
Mhm.
don't know really what happened. Like, what would you say to somebody who is saying that, kind of based on your experiences?
somebody who's saying we should wait till all evidence is out, or
Yeah,
like,
exactly. Before we choose to believe anybody.
well, that makes sense from a legal perspective. But what you aren't is a lawyer. You are of the public opinion. The public opinion doesn't have to follow those laws, those policies, those you know, those guidelines. Public opinion, you know, can be as devastating as legal consequences, but you know, just because the law says that, like, you know, innocent till proven guilty, fine. But you, like we said earlier, like talking about supporting them and still following them on their social media, going to their streams, doing all this stuff, that's just because they're innocent till proven guilty doesn't mean you have to support them till proven guilty. You can still not support someone, and their innocence in the legal eye is still there. You can still believe the accuser and be supportive towards the accuser, and the abuser still can be innocent in the legal eye. So these two concepts are not mutually exclusive, where you have to be like, well, I have to kind of leave my idea that of innocence until proven guilty if I choose to believe the survivor. No, that's not the case. These aren't mutually exclusive concepts. You can do both.
Um, do you? I guess like one of the other big ones, and you might
Mhm.
be able to shed some light on this, and maybe this isn't necessarily maybe your experiences this is a little bit different, but you know,
Okay.
one of the other things that people like to say is or one of the things that people like to cite is like the well, what if she's making it up, or what if he's making it up, or they're
Yeah.
doing this for clout, or you know, they're doing it to get revenge because of X, Y, and Z. um like, do you have any insight as to A, whether that happens, and B, like what can I say if I want to engage somebody who is saying that type of thing? Because like, obviously, that I obviously coming from the mindset of like, let's, you know, believe victims. How should we talk to people like that?
Yeah. So oftentimes people will grasp for those arguments of like, well, look, here's an example of someone who faked it, and the other person was, you know, totally was canceled, and now look, they were faking it, which happens and it sucks. But it doesn't happen to the extent that we believe it. I don't have the exact stats, but the stats are out there that, like, going through this, just put yourself in that perspective for a second. If you were somebody, a normal, an average person who hasn't had any sort of sexual violence or abuse towards them, and you want to start making stuff up to get a, you know, a vet because you have a vendetta against somebody, it's not amazing to do that. It's not a great feeling to do that. You're not suddenly rewarded with money and fame and clout, even though you think you're rewarded with clout on the internet. I mean, you really aren't. I mean, sure, you're going to get some engagement, but it's not, that engagement is not worth it. The only type of people that would ever really do that are terrible human beings. And like, honestly, just because someone, you know, there are terrible human beings in all categories of people. This doesn't mean that just because someone accuses someone of something that your immediate thought should be like, well, they're wrong, they're lying, or that should be the first step we go to. And so like, people who grasp onto that ideology have this, I don't know why they do it, because it's so not true. And in my line of work and what I do, my first thing that I'm trained all the time to do, and this is part of my ethos, is I believe what the person is telling me. Because if I go down the route of not believing them, then I'm not providing them any sort of support that's necessary for this particular platform. If I go down the route of not believing this survivor of abuse, then I choose to believe that the abuser is innocent and that the abuser is a really great individual. And then the abusee is kind of like just totally discredited and totally not supportive. And like I just mentioned earlier, all these mental health issues, suicide, self-harm, and trauma just increases exponentially, and it's just not worth it. So like, people who want to go to down the route of like, well, we should, you know, there's these fake instances of, you know, people coming out and making up stuff. Sure, there are, but they're not that many. I mean, you know, like, we can't always, the point of, like I said earlier, believing someone and accepting what they say as truth doesn't mean you immediately say that the abuser is guilty legally. And so these are not mutually exclusive concepts. You can believe the survivor and say, you know what, when this goes into legal proceedings, we will see where things end up. The legal system is not perfect, but what we do as saying we accept what the survivor has said is we provide them a space to feel better, and we alleviate all of these negative or like trauma experiences that they're dealing with, and we help them out. Why would we not want to help out our fellow human beings?
Right. And I guess I feel like to me, and this is not based on any sort of literature or anything like that, but like from my perspective, okay, sure, let's assume, just for the sake of argument, that this person is making this up. The
Yeah.
5 seconds of gratitude, that like gratification that they're going to get from me saying, hey, I believe you, thank you for telling your story, is minuscule compared to the amount of harm that it could cause to somebody if they are telling the truth and you say, well, actually, I think you might be lying. And
Mhm.
also pales in comparison to the benefits that you can give to somebody who is telling the truth, for saying the same thing to them, that I believe you, and thank you for coming forward. Like, there's just the net benefit and negative, like the weighing the possible outcomes. It just always seems to make sense to believe. And I think that you bring up a really good point, that like you can believe somebody and still feel like we'll see what happens. You know what I mean? Like, that was a really poor way of putting it, but like you can believing somebody and thinking that somebody, and wanting to get to the truth, whatever that means. Like, you can do both of those things. Like, it
Yeah,
just
exactly.
um a lot of people are also super critical of the fact that, like, so for example, I'm sure I know you pretty well, so like I know that you've read a lot of these stories, and I'm sure that you've kind of looked at some of the threads, and like obviously some of these things are from a really really long time ago.
Mhm.
um and like people are also super critical of that. Like, I mean, first of all, what's your understanding of like why people wait to report?
Mhm.
And like, should we be skeptical of people who do wait?
So, yeah, so for me in my training, when I speak to survivors of or who are fleeing abuse, or just talking about their abuse, it ranges from someone who's 20 years old, who's it just happened to them like a day ago, to people who are in their 60s, 70s, who say that it's happened like 50, 40 years ago. The reason people come out at different times, and the reason why it takes longer for people to come longer for people to come out with their stories, is because sexual abuse, violence, any form of abuse, is there's always a power dynamic involved. And the power that the person who's being abused loses that power, is gaslighted into believing that nothing is going wrong, nothing is wrong, and nothing that's happening to them is, is bad, because the person who's abusing them is using these manipulative strategies to change the narrative, and to making them think that it's their fault, and that, you know they asked for it, or like, this is normal, you're blowing it out of proportion, all of these things. And so when what that does to a person, it takes a lot of time, when you've been conditioned like that, to reverse that and break that down, to break that apart. And so when people come out 20 years later, 10 years later, whatever the number is, whatever their particular number is for their own journey, it's because they've had to take that time to really break that down in their own head, and start to unravel layer by layer of each manipulative strategy that this person used in order to abuse them. And sometimes different people are different. So for some people it's not that long, for others it's very long, and for others it's pervasive, it's multiple people. People always, it's like we're stuck thinking that it's just like one person abused me, and they did some manipulation after break, and it's gonna how is it possible that it's taking you 30 years to realize this? It could be systemic, it could be multiple people in their families that are doing this, or that they know who are close to them doing this. It could be separate occasions, and they just, imagine if it's happened to you multiple times, and you're the common denominator. You start to think, gosh, is it my fault? And so you further bury these ideas deep within your head and you don't come to terms with it. And so when I work on the lines and I talk to these individuals, it's so hard for them to break it down because you have to uncondition the conditioning that's been done to you by your abuser. And so that's why it takes long for some folks. And so for people to use that number that it's taking them this amount of time, why don't you come out sooner? You should just come out sooner when you know, from the get-go and say it. It's because it's hard to see that it wasn't your fault. And this isn't even not talking about the other issue of like the justice system not being perfect. So like going to the you know, there, I think there's a stat out there that says that there's a certain number of sexual assaults and rapes that are reported to the police, and only like the only action only is done to 3 to 5% of them against the rapist, which is insane. You know, that's crazy. These women cannot be lying about this stuff. There's no reason. I'm sure we can like grasp at straws and say one of them is lying, but one out of the thousands is not enough to totally invalidate the 95% who are not getting justice.
Yeah. I I think that one thing that you touched on earlier is really important, and especially in this context, and it was this concept of like power dynamics, right?
Mhm.
Because a lot of this kind of cultural reckoning on Twitch has been levied against partners, large
Yeah.
streamers who have a large following, who have sponsorships, and you know, partner with brands and stuff like that. And like for somebody who is either just trying to start out as a streamer, or somebody who is trying to break into a circle of, you know, bigger streamers, like certainly that power dynamic is there. And I think that that's something that like maybe some people don't recognize about Twitch as a platform, is that like you have the ability to influence the growth of other streams if you are large enough. And that in and of itself is like an extreme power dynamic between people, right? So like we hear about these things, and like it's a pretty common factor in a lot of these stories, is that, like I was starting to grow. I felt like I couldn't say anything because of the power that this person wielded, and if I did say something and like caused a problem, I my career would be over. and
Yeah.
and so I think that like that's a large part of it too. I mean, like that, like you were saying, like that's an integral part of a lot of these stories.
Yeah, 100%. And you can take that, and it's a parallel to what's happening in the offline, in the real world, the offline world. You know, these women who were in corporate positions and all these positions are coming out and saying like, I was afraid to say it because he was my boss and I needed to put food on the table. This is the same ideology on Twitch. It's the same idea. There are partners, and you're an affiliate, or if you're a smaller streamer or you're a partner or whatever, there's a power dynamic there. Could be a sponsor, it could even be a staff member at Twitch. And for you to go against that grain, or against the grain, like the over, like this hierarchy, means that you're putting your own livelihood in jeopardy. And so as much as you want to come out and say, you know, this is happening to me, in your mind, and this is normal to think, you're afraid of losing all of these other things, your money, the food that you put on the table, your audience, the, you know, the power that you have in your content you feel like will be diminished because you're going against a bigger content creator. And so these content creators that are bigger use this because they've realized this to their advantage, because they're in positions of power. And if you're in a position of power, things are more easily handed to you. And you think that sex and all these things will be more easily handed to you because you have a little bit of power over this other streamer, and you're going to give them all these sweet nothings of like, I can help you with this growth. Or it's not like, people think that these abusers go to these smaller content creators, and by the way, I'm using the term smaller just in relative terms,
Hmm.
these content creators, and say, give me sex and I'll give you views. They don't say that explicitly. That's not how manipulation works. You know what I mean? And if that happens, I mean, and someone falls for that, we shouldn't fault them for falling for that. Like, how could you fall for that? That's so ridiculous. No, I mean, it actually happens. But these manipulators are smart in what they do. They say a phrase that talks nothing about their abuse. I mean, I hear this all the time on their lines. Like, how do women get stuck in these relationships? It's because they start off by giving what they think the person wants. You know, I can give you engagement, I can give you some raids, or like not even saying that explicitly, but being like, I think your content is really cool, you know, sliding into DMs of this of a content creator. I think your content is so cool, you know, like maybe we could collab one time. And then this individual's like, oh my God, that's awesome. Like, I'm totally down. And then they start talking a little bit. And then he starts saying things like, you know what? I actually kind of want to admit something. I think you're kind of cute. And like, I really like you. That's his first. And by the way, I'm using the word his, but it could be anybody.
Sure.
But that's their first way of, you know, putting this little seed of like, this is what my ulterior motive is into this person's brain. And they say like, okay, he thinks I'm cute. Like, okay, well, fine. He thinks I'm cute. Like, okay, whatever. And then obviously if someone says that you're cute, you're not gonna be like, how dare you say that to me? You're trying to abuse me. That's not abuse. That's just someone saying you're cute. And you're like, okay, fine. So then you let that slide. And he knows that you let that slide. So next time he's gonna inch a little further. Sorry, I keep using the word he, but I mean they. They're gonna inch a little further and they're gonna, you know, that's how it happens. And it doesn't happen in 2 seconds. It happens over time. And that's how the power dynamic happens. I mean, it can happen in 2 seconds, the actual act. But the buildup takes time, and it's building rapport with the person you want to abuse, basically.
Yeah,
And that's what happens on Twitch. Partners are viewed at a higher, you know, they're in the hierarchy of the Twitch world. Partners are here, and then within the partners, there's levels of like viewership and engagement, and your Twitter follows and your Instagram follows, and then you're deemed more valuable than this person, and that's how it happens.
One thing that I have wondered about, I mean, is there, and this is like complete conspiracy theory, but like, you know, the Twitch makes its money off of content creators. Like that's how like there's advertisers and stuff like that. But like, you know, when we get a sub, girl, $2.50 of that sub goes straight to Twitch's pocket. And for partners, it's sometimes less because they can negotiate their contracts and like, you know, do whatever. But like, is there a vested interest in keeping these people on the platform?
I mean, there is, because it is a conflict of interest. I mean, you're a corporation that's making money from this person, and that's your end goal, is to make money. But on the other hand, they're also a really shitty person, and they're violating human beings, actually, to some extent, on a legal scale that will actually have legal ramifications as well. So as a business, you sit there and you're like, well, we have investors that we need to satisfy. We have sponsors that we need to keep coming in. We need the money to pay our staff, but we feel bad about what's happening to you. So, like I said earlier, if these people aren't going to come out and admit it, they're not, and Twitch is only reprimanding the folks that are admitting it and the ones that aren't confirming or denying the allegations, then in Twitch's mind, their pocket stays healthy and fed. And so there's no incentive for them to like, which sucks. There's no incentive for them to stand by survivors besides using, just by saying platitudes and being like, we're looking into it and we stand with what you're saying and we hear you and here are 5 bans. You know, it's so much deeper than that. It's actually deeper than Twitch. It's deep in the gaming culture, in the developing culture, like in the game developer culture. It's very deep, pervasive sexual misconduct. And so, you know, we want to hold Twitch to these high standards, but we have to hold not only Twitch, game development companies, sponsors, you know, content creators. We need to hold everybody all around to a higher standard. And it's tough when you're a business because, like, yeah, you know, like we mentioned, there's a conflict of interest there. And so,
Right.
is there ever going to really be resolution?
And well, and I don't bring that up to be like, I don't bring that up to like start a, you know, like uprising against Twitch, but like I think the idea is that, look, there are reasons why a response might be slower. It might be less than what people are asking for. It might, you know, encompass fewer streamers than people feel that it should. But like that doesn't mean that we should just accept that. I think,
Yep.
you know, we can use our voices to ask for more, demand more, and if that, you know, and if we can use, you know, our wallets to do that too.
100%. 100%. Don't support them. If you see someone that you're watching on Twitch come up on these sexual misconduct lists and you know, do your research, look into it, and this shit is scary to you and doesn't follow your own ethos and morals, then stop watching them. Stop subbing and stop giving them your money. that's how we as a community can fight this in a way that affects wallets. And when you affect people's wallets, they really start to listen.
Um, okay, well, first of all, Sammy, thank you so much for agreeing to talk with me. I think we had a really good conversation. Is there anything else about this topic or these topics that we've been talking about, in particular, either based on your experiences working with survivors or based on your experience as a streamer, that you think it's important to say?
Um, just because we're both part of the LGBTQI plus community, I do want to bring this up that this can happen to anyone. A power dynamic, even I had to catch myself throughout this conversation because I kept saying he as the abuser, and I would kept on thinking of a woman as the person being abused. But that's not always the case, and it's important to normalize that that's not always the case, so that folks who men, people in the LGBTQ plus community, folks who don't follow particular gender roles, realize that these can happen to you. And this power dynamic doesn't discriminate based on gender, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, country of origin. It doesn't discriminate. And so hopefully folks in our community, in the LGBTQ plus community, are also paying attention to this and calling it out when it happens in our own community, because you know, gay men, listen closely, okay? We have this whole idea of we objectify men all the time. We objectify men all the time, and it somehow is okay because we're gay, and we sometimes portray that objectification by physically touching people and saying really inappropriate things. And so we need to not normalize that, and we need to normalize behaving uh, properly uh, towards other people within our own community as well. So this isn't just a cis het thing; it's an everyone thing.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. So Sammy, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate
Thank you
it.
for having me.
We love seeing you here. So first of all, I really want to thank everybody who I was able to interview for their insights and for their thoughts. I do appreciate it. When I was deciding to make this video, I reached out across multiple social media platforms and asked for people to share their thoughts and you know, insight about these topics that we've been talking about. And I was lucky enough to get people from kind of across different academic and practical spectrums. And I was also able to reach out to people who were not super comfortable appearing on camera, but who wanted to give me their thoughts. One of my friends was somebody who did that, and she prepared a statement. And I'm going to go ahead and read that word for word for you right now. She's not comfortable being on camera. The last thing I want to do is re-traumatize anybody or to cause them any sort of discomfort, because I know that being on camera isn't for everybody, and I know that these are incredibly personal stories, incredibly personal thoughts for some people, including my friend. So I'm going to go ahead and read my friend's statement now, and I hope that you can take something away from it. So I feel like a lot of my talking points require at least some background for context. Please forgive me if it's too long or wordy. It's a story I've rarely told, because as I learned, people don't actually like to hear these kinds of stories when they know the people involved. My freshman year of college, it was a few months into my first semester, and it was one of my first times drinking at a party. I was drunk, but not outrageously so. A guy who was a senior in my theater department accidentally elbowed me in the face as I was taking a swig from a bottle, and I cut my lip. He said he lived in the apartment across the hall and could take me there and help clean me up. We got to talking and eventually went back to the party, where he encouraged me to drink more. When I got drunker and wanted to go to bed, he told my friends he would let me crash on his couch. They all protested, but I was too tired and intoxicated to feel motivated to walk all the way back to my dorm, so I agreed to crash on the couch. Nothing sexual happened, but my friends were all weirded out by this situation. I was stupid enough to think, wow, he didn't even try to sleep with me. What low standards, but that's the society we live in. Long story short, we ended up dating. All of my friends were concerned that he seemed predatory and didn't really understand why a senior wanted to date a freshman, but eventually he won them over too. I didn't realize it at the time, but he was incredibly manipulative and excellent at gaslighting, so much so that even when I was experiencing it, I never would have recognized it, and didn't recognize it until much later, when I was actually able to get out of the relationship. But we dated for 2 years, and during that time, he cheated on me several times. I remember the second time I was suspicious and was 98% certain he had engaged with someone else. I had to strategize with my best friend how to write up all my points so I could say them all and not get sidetracked or have him divert the conversation. And somehow these weren't red flags to either her or I. It seems so outrageous now in hindsight. I eventually broke up with him when I moved away for the summer for an acting gig across the country. It wasn't until I was physically away from him and surrounded by an entirely new group of people that I was able to see how unhappy I was. I didn't even necessarily recognize it as toxic, just that I knew I wasn't happy. He didn't take it well, and he kept threatening to fly out to come see me because I didn't get to decide that. However, eventually he accepted that we were no longer dating, but insisted that we had to still be friends because he had given up on a job opportunity and signed a lease to stay in our college town since I was still attending. Also, since we had been in the same theater department, our circle of friends was essentially one and the same anyway. Fast forward about 10 months, and I had just broken up with another guy that I had been seeing for approximately 6 months. That weekend, my friends and I decided to go out, and my ex ended up coming. I just realized I haven't said his name yet. It's Ben. Ben came with us. After a dumping that I didn't see coming, I got pretty drunk that night. The whole night, Ben kept trying to come on to me, and I kept turning him down because I told him I didn't feel that way about him anymore. He said I didn't have to have feelings. I told him it wouldn't be fair to him. How pathetic that I was using reasoning concentrated on his feelings rather than my own. Fast forward to the end of the night, and our DD is driving us and dropping us off at our respective houses. First, a group of 4 of my friends that lived together. Next was Ben. I had been complaining about having to pee the entire car ride, and Ben just told me to come pee in his apartment, and that he would drive me home because he wasn't drunk anymore and was good to drive. I refused and told him I would wait, but he kept insisting and I really did have to go. So I agreed. We went to his little studio apartment and I used the bathroom and came out ready to go. He told me that he had to use the bathroom as well, but that I could just sit and wait, and he referenced the bed. No couch. I sat down and waited, and waited, and waited. I'd called out for him and he acknowledged me, so I thought he must be pooping. Eventually, I reclined a bit and my eyes closed and fell asleep. It should be noted that I am an extremely heavy sleeper in any state, but once I have alcohol in my system, I can be near impossible to wake up. The next thing I remember is feeling pressure and pain and opening my eyes. I was laying on my stomach completely nude, and Ben was naked on top of me. I immediately started panicking and thrashing. I was screaming, "What the fuck?" I started sobbing. He was trying to come towards me and was shouting, "You're fine, you're fine." I put the bed in between us and grabbed my pants and shirt from the floor and screamed at him not to come near me. I ran out the door naked, clothes in hand, and ran about 100 feet down the street before I hastily threw the shirt over my head and slipped on my pants. I was running barefoot down the street, full speed sprinting at like 2:30 in the morning, and I ran all the way back to where my 4 friends lived and began pounding on the door. To my surprise, my 2 girlfriends were waiting for me, like they were expecting me. They let me in and were super concerned. Then my friend told me, "What's going on? Ben just called me and told me that you might going around saying he raped you, but that's not true." I was dumbfounded, but also not thinking straight. I collapsed on the floor sobbing and tried to tell them what happened. It was at this point they realized my shirt was on backwards and inside out, and it was obvious I had been through something traumatic. They took me to the hospital and I had a rape exam done, which was also traumatizing. A male officer kept asking me if I wanted to press charges. This was all at 4 in the morning the same day, and I was overwhelmed and just wanted to go home. Except not home because I lived alone and was terrified. My friends offered to let me stay with them, and I was so grateful. The next few days I honestly barely remember. It was like my body was present, but my mind was not. After 3 days of staying with my friends, I noticed they were being awfully strange and would be whispering a lot and then be quiet when I came by. I tried asking about it, but it was sort of ignored. Finally, my best friend texted me while I was in class the next day and told me that it was probably about time that I started staying at my own place again. I couldn't believe it. I had been raped less than 96 hours ago, and it was already time for me to get over it and go home. My best friend told me she didn't mind me staying with them, but it was starting to annoy her other roommates / my other friends. I asked if there was something specific I was doing that was bothering them, or if there was somehow I could be a better house guest, and she said no, it's honestly just really inconvenient. And that's when it hit me. My pain, my trauma, it was inconvenient. It wasn't something across the country that became a meme that people could share. My rapist wasn't some stranger that they could condemn for hours in the Facebook comment section. They both knew us, and that put them in an uncomfortable position. So I went back home, and that's when my life ultimately changed. I was ready to press charges, but when it came down to it, the police told me it would be my word against his and that there was nothing they could do. I didn't understand. What about the bruising on my thighs? What about the rape exam? What about the fact that before I even got to my friend's house, after he had already preemptively called them to say, hey, just so you know, I didn't rape someone? Surely that had to be a sign of his guilt. They just told me that there was no way to prove it wasn't consensual because there were not witnesses. Which is just an absurd amount of fuckery. This brings me to my talking points. This all occurred in my liberal arts school BFA theater program, probably one of the most liberal environments you can imagine. If a rape survivor is going to in any community to heal, that's got to be one of the best, right? And you can't imagine how wrong. None of my friends broke contact with Ben. They remained friends and tried to hide it from me behind my back. This all occurred towards the end of my junior year of college. My immediate friends knew what happened, and one of my professors knew what happened because she was directing a professional production at the time that I was cast in, and Ben was a stage manager. I felt I had to tell her because there was no way I could continue going to rehearsals with him. The professor probably took the most action out of anyone, but it was still incredibly apparent to me that she saw me as an inconvenience. Now she had to find a replacement. Was I going to be all right to continue doing the show, etc. Other than that, Ben suffered absolutely no consequences. My friends, the most ultra-liberal, BLM, Me Too kind of supporting people you can imagine, didn't care that he had raped me. By the time my senior year rolled around and Ben moved out of town, it was pretty much mentally checked out, turning to other vices as coping mechanisms. But I will never forget the day that I finally confronted one of my good friends and said, "How can you still be friends with Ben? You need to cut him off or I can't go on like this." And he looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Bridget, we can't stop being friends with Ben. Carla, the academic head of our theater department, told us that he's a really good contact to have in the industry, and we can't lose that. He can possibly get us an audition at his theater company." And that's the day that I stopped giving a fuck. Theater, my passion, my love and drive for it faded in that instant. Theater people love to pat themselves on the back for how liberal they are, and how outspoken they are for the unheard and the injustices that occur in this world. And yet, when it came down to it, it didn't matter if you had a rapist in a position of power at a theater company. You had to be friends with that rapist to work at said theater company. Also, my academic advisor, the head of the musical theater department, never actually took the time to speak with me about what happened. I knew she knew what had happened, and yet she never approached me about it, despite her getting involved in the personal lives of all her students. And yet she felt uncomfortable telling my peers that my story was no reason for them to lose out. Yet she felt comfortable telling my peers that my story was no reason for them to lose out on another industry connection. Believing victims is so crucial, because it cannot just be a familiar phrase. It's so easy to preach that online, but when it came down to the people in my theater department who I have seen countless Me Too posts, who I have seen post countless Me Too posts in recent years, didn't fully believe me. I had to deal with my own peers saying things like, "Well, hadn't you been drinking?" And, "Well, you guys used to date, so it's not like it was anything you hadn't done." It was like somehow they could justify or twist any trauma I had experienced so that they didn't have to make a hard or inconvenient choice when it came to their friendships. Somehow, in their minds, my situation wasn't like all the other women's that they could get behind and support. This skeptical approach made me so hesitant to talk to anyone about what happened to me. I went to a counselor, but I didn't really talk about it with my friends or family. I felt like no one actually cared about me. It was like everything I believed in and everyone I trusted wasn't real anymore. I ended up making some really bad choices and turned to drugs and alcohol as coping mechanisms to numb my pain. And I missed out on so many things during my senior year of college because I was numbing myself to the fact that I didn't have any real friends who stood by me. And this was in addition to the actual trauma of being raped and struggling with how that in and of itself affected me, especially considering it was someone I used to trust and thought I loved. Not believing victims or even questioning their stories/feelings feels like such a slap in the face. When people pointed out the fact that I had been drinking, I didn't understand it. In my head, it was like, yeah, and It didn't mean that I wanted it to happen. In fact, I had been discouraging him all night. Many people thought I was just drunk and let it happen, which still also wouldn't have been okay. But I remember consciously turning on my side to lean on my arm and close my eyes because he was taking so long. He waited until I was passed out to take off my clothes and rape me. It was all incredibly intentional on his part. The fact that I had been drinking that night didn't excuse or justify anything. Being supportive is so much more than sharing viral posts and memes. It's so much more than posting heartfelt statuses on your social media. Being supportive means you have to treat the people you know the same way as you treat the people you don't in these situations. Every single one of my college friends, the same ones who didn't break their friendship with my rapist because he was an industry contact, have posted on Facebook multiple times about their disdain for Brett Kavanaugh and their support of the Me Too movement. The hypocrisy was so glaring to me, and yet a shadow of that thought probably never crosses their mind. Because if they even still remember, in their minds my situation was different. There were other factors involved. Being supportive means wanting the same consequences for all rapists, even if that rapist is someone you know. A compassionate response is recognizing that the situation isn't about you. If a close friend of yours experiences something like this, you should be ready and willing to listen and hear their story if it is something they want to share. I'm not saying people need to be armchair therapists for their friends, and I believe all sexual assault survivors should seek out counseling. But that's what close friends do. They support each other through the good times and the bad. And being sexually assaulted is one of the worst bads, and people will need their friends. A compassionate response is responding with active empathy, i.e., I am so sorry, do you want to talk about it? Or, is this something you would like to talk about right now, or would you rather be distracted? A compassionate response is going with the flow and doing what you personally can to make the person feel better in that moment. Maybe it's holding their hand while they let it out and cry. Maybe it's inviting them with you to go on a walk with your dog to distract them, or having them over for a cup of coffee. Please don't ever ask questions that minimize the trauma the survivor has experienced, i.e., well, it could have been so much worse, or at least he didn't kill you, or, well, I mean, was his penis actually inside you? Yes, someone actually asked me that. No matter how well-intentioned, it is so disparaging and can be construed by the survivor as dismissiveness or doubt. So, I'm sure that was as hard for you guys to hear as it was for me to read. Thank you so much to my friend for sharing their story. It's incredibly brave. She also shared with me that she's incredibly angry about everybody that is not facing consequences. She's angry that survivors are not getting justice for these things that are happening. So I hope that through listening to these conversations and through listening to the story that my friend was brave enough to share, that you can understand why we need to listen and why it's so damaging not to. And one of the things that my friend shared in her story that is, I think, applicable to the situation on Twitch is that this was somebody who was respected in a community, a smaller community, a niche community. This was a local community, but still somebody who had power within that community. And that is what we are seeing so many people share on Twitter about Twitch streamers. This is also somebody that the people who were questioning my friend knew. And, you know, as streamers, a lot of times viewers believe that they have some sort of personal connection with the streamer. They watch them every day. They get to see them respond contemporaneously to things that happen on the screen. They talk to chat. They even get to talk to the streamer themselves. This is, there's a term for this called a parasocial relationship, which I encourage you all to read a little bit more about. But at the end of the day, the people who are defaulting to skepticism, the people who are questioning the survivors, it's because they feel like they know the person being accused. And you can see what kind of damage that can do when somebody from within your own community, somebody that maybe you think that you're friends with, or maybe you think that you know, um, doesn't believe you when you come forward and share your story. And so that's why it's so important um, to listen to survivors. And I hope that, you know, like I said, through listening to the conversations that I've had and through listening to my friend's story and through your own introspection and your own independent readings and your own compassion, you can realize how important that is. Hi guys, so as I said at the beginning of the video, this is kind of the second broad topic that I want to talk about, and this is going to be kind of a pivot from talking with people who kind of know what they're talking about and have experience working with survivors to switch gears and talk just a little bit more about the consequences um, and espouse some discourse TM. I should preface this portion of the video with saying that this isn't really based on empirical or analytical academic data and research, but I think it's an important discussion nonetheless. And I think that I have valid points to make. I think that I have valid points to make, and I think that they're super defensible. So this second topic is what people think the consequences are going to be when we take the default position of believing survivors. And specifically with respect to the person accused of misconduct. You know, you hear these things like, well, we don't want to act until we know all the facts because if we cancel this person, if this person gets canceled, we are going to ruin their entire life. And what if it turns out that the person coming forward wasn't telling the truth, or that they misremembered something, or something less charitable or more charitable? What about then? Because we've canceled them. Like their life is over, and for what? Um, so I think the first part of this discussion is a question of definitions. Um, I am going to operate off of a very specific definition when I talk about cancellation throughout this short segment. Um, in my mind, to be canceled, you have to exist in and exert some level of power. That can be political power, that can be social power, that can be power within an institution, such as a company, or as you heard from my friend's story, within a community of some sorts. Because the idea behind cancellation is that there are institutions or some sort of safety net that is going to protect the person in power from formal consequences. Now, that's not to say that you can't have adverse social or economic effects happen to you because of online activism if you don't exist in that kind of realm of power. But I would posit that that is something other than cancellation, because the influence and power that you wield generally can't protect you from formal consequences in that sort of space. It's a materially different situation from cancellation, I think. I'm not sure what the word is. I don't have a good or cogent term for what that is, but when I think about cancellation, I don't think about like me or Tom, Dick, and Harry down the road. Like I don't consider them. If I were to have done something bad and it were to come out and the internet would get mad at me and call my job and get me fired, I wouldn't have considered myself to be canceled. I think that that is something different. I think that yes, I experienced something bad because of that. You know, your conceptions of justice will determine whether you think that it's fair or not that that happened to me. But at the end of the day, I wasn't canceled, because to be canceled, you have to exist in a public light in some way. Because the point of cancellation, you know, where cancellation started, and if you watch YouTube, ContraPoints did a video on cancellation, and she lays this out. Um, According to ContraPoints, cancellation kind of started gaining internet traction around the time that Cancel R. Kelly was trending. And that was because R. Kelly existed in a space at that time, which put him beyond the reach of traditional forms of justice. Formal mechanisms of justice could not reach him there, and they refused to hold him accountable because of his status. So cancellation is based on the use of social power in a way that brings justice where those formal mechanisms otherwise would fail. So necessarily then, from my perspective, cancellation requires the accused to wield significant relative power. And when I say the word relative, I mean it seriously, because I think that you have to look at it in with relativity, because somebody who wields a lot of power on Twitch, a big partnered streamer with a lot of viewers, has corporate sponsors. They have the ear of Twitch. They're a large source of revenue for Twitch. They have a large portion of power relative to other members of the community, but they don't have the same level of absolute power as somebody like an A-list Hollywood celebrity or director. I mean, it's just obviously they don't have the same level of absolute power, but they have similar, or I guess I would say they have concomitant levels of relative power. So that's why I think it's important to qualify that with relativity. They're both relatively powerful in their relevant spheres. And so this is a conception of cancellation that I'm comfortable with. I feel like it's defensible, and that is what I'm going to be talking about during this segment when I'm talking about cancellation. And so my hot take, the big takeaway from this section, is that I don't think that cancellation works. And ergo, cancel culture is both at once ineffective and not real. I think that the reason that cancellation doesn't work is because I think it's a double-edged sword. Because I think that it exists in a sphere where we can demand change on a social level in a way that we cannot do so through formal means. It's appealing because it's an avenue towards accountability when we feel like either our voices are being ignored or we feel like we don't have a chance for justice within the formal mechanisms that exist. It's a way that robs the institutions built to protect the people in power of that power. It's direct action, and it's based on communal ideals of justice. So it's super appealing, and I understand why people attempt to engage with it. And that is not to say that people don't experience negative outcomes from cancellation, especially concerted efforts at cancellation, right? People lose their jobs. People lose their sponsors. People are being deplatformed on Twitch right now. I mean, people are experiencing bad outcomes. So I guess I should say this. I invited Sammy, Simple Sammy, to talk with me a little bit more about cancel culture, especially as it relates to Twitch. And so you're going to hear us talk a little bit about whether, what a cancellation on Twitch would look like. But that also leads me into the other side of the coin, the other edge of the double-edged sword, is that the very nature of the people who are susceptible to cancellation ensures that any sort of cancellation is going to be short-lived and minimal. It's not going to seriously impact their material well-being, i.e. their lives are not going to be ruined from getting canceled. And that is because they exist in a space in which they wield some power. For example, in the real world, offline world, Kevin Spacey was canceled because of the allegations of sexual misconduct, which were, we believe and were very founded. We canceled him. I don't know when the last time he had an acting job was, but let me tell you this. He still has royalty checks coming. He still has the money and the power and the fame from when he was still working. He is fine, and he will continue to be fine. And you will hear Sammy and I talk about, within the realm of Twitch, there are other streaming platforms that may or may not accept the people who have been banned off of Twitch, but at the very least, they can go private and stream private on a private platform if they're big enough. They can continue to work within the industry. I'm sure that they can still find a job within the industry. I think that these people are going to be okay at the end of the day. And in particular with Twitch, when we're not talking about people super prominent within society at large. Now, this is, setting aside huge people like Ninja or Dr. Disrespect or things like that. And that's not to say that either one of them have been implicated in either of these things, because as far as I know that they haven't been. I'm just using them as examples of people who might be like household names of streamers. my point is that if I am a big partnered streamer on Twitch, but I'm not a household name, and I get banned off of Twitch, I can switch industries and nobody is probably going to hear of that. Um, and so this is this is a long way of saying that the results of being canceled, the results of cancellation, are not as serious as I think some people believe that they would be. Um, because I also think that it's worth saying at this point, and this is kind of jumping back to definitions, you are not canceled. You are not canceled if you go to jail, because that is the justice system working as intended and sending you through the mechanisms that we have and the institutions that we have to prison. And that requires a trial. It requires a plea, or a number of other a number of other steps within the formal justice system. That's not cancellation. That is literally just justice. And so, when we talk about, oh, well, they're going to go to jail and they're going to get their lives ruined, it's like, that's not cancellation. That's not cancellation. Cancellation is the opposite of that. And so don't let that draw you into arguing with somebody online either, because that's not what cancellation is. So when I say that cancel culture doesn't work, that's what I mean. I mean, the consequences of somebody being canceled generally aren't long-ranging or far-reaching. And most of the time, because of the relative power that you enjoy being in a position where you are susceptible to cancellation, you are going to end up being okay at the end of the day. And so when I say cancel culture isn't real, I mean that both in like an ideological sense, in that like a lot of liberals and a lot of leftists like to say, well, cancel culture doesn't exist because you're not being canceled. You're just being held accountable for your actions. Okay, so from like an ideological sense, we can argue about whether that's fair or whether that's a good characterization or not. Cancel culture doesn't exist. But from a practical sense, cancel culture does not exist, because these people have an incredible resilience to bounce back from being canceled. And that is something that Sammy and I also talk about. I think about the people on YouTube who have been canceled multiple times, and they're still being platformed and they're still making money. And these are even people that I like. Like I talked about ContraPoints earlier. ContraPoints has been canceled online several times, and she is still on the platform. She is still doing her good work, and she is still making money doing it. Cancellation oftentimes does not work. And I don't want to speak in absolutes, but in terms of trends, in terms of the way that we're defining the term, and in terms of the conceptions of power and privilege, cancellation by and large just cannot work. So I implore you to think, when you're thinking about cancellation, when's the last time somebody's life was completely ruined because of it? And please just think and engage with yourself and try to figure out, like, what are we really even talking about here? So I guess it's kind of begs the question. So like, why are we talking about this? So, like, what does this have to do with the topics we've been talking about? Well, the first is the most obvious, because it's one of the reasons people give as to why they don't want to believe survivors until they have all the facts, because they're afraid of cancellation. And that is something that Sammy and I talk about also. Also, if you're utilitarian, thinking ethically and morally, that's just being a framing device for centering this conversation. I'm not a utilitarian, but I think that if we consider the net benefits and harms from choosing to believe the survivor or taking a skeptical approach, the net benefits to believing the survivor are always going to be higher. And I also think, though, that approach then necessarily requires us to think about the potential consequences of the accused. And I want to make it really clear when I say that, I don't think that means that we should worry more about them than the survivor. I don't think that the worry that we should have for them is morally equivalent of a survivor, nor do I think that we really should be worrying about them at all, or what they think or what they're going through. I mean, obviously, we don't want people to, self-harm because of these reports and survivor stories, but at the same time, we should not be centering their feelings. So I want to make that very clear. But I do think that if we're trying to be cool, rational people, like so many of the people in the comments sections try to be, we need to necessarily engage with them on that front and think about what the potential consequences could be. And for the reasons that I've talked about, and for the reasons that you'll hear me talk about with Sammy, I just don't think that the reasons, the potential outcomes for the accused can ever outweigh the value of listening to the survivor, and believing their story. And so, as I said, I invited Simple Sammy to chat with me a little bit more about cancellation and cancel culture, specifically as it relates to the Twitch community. And so I hope you get something from that conversation as well. Yeah, I want to talk to you about like cancellation in particular as it happens online,
Mm-hmm.
versus like in real life, and also as it might pertain to Twitch in particular. So like
Okay.
one thing that I think, and you mentioned this a little bit ago, but like I guess it gets into semantics, but like what I would like getting retaliated against for like retaliation in the legal sense against for like reporting harassment, or like an 18-year-old who like gets kicked out of school or whatever for using the N-word online. Let's say that they're
Mm-hmm.
not anonymous. Like I don't
Okay.
consider those things getting canceled, because to be canceled you have to have some sort of social relevance in a broader sense. um Otherwise it's just like malicious retaliation or something like that. You know what, like I think it's a different thing. When I think about getting canceled, I think about like the hand-wringing people online who are like, oh, we can't cancel X, Y, and Z streamer because they're so big. Like, all you're trying to do is ruin their career. Like, you're just jealous of their success. Like, whatever their justifications are going to be. When I think about cancellation in particular, as like the word cancel, not just
Mm-hmm.
having repercussions for like having done a shitty thing. Cancellation requires you to be in some sort of position of relative power, because otherwise you're just like, if you canceled, like fucking if you canceled me tomorrow, like I wouldn't consider myself to have been canceled. I would consider myself to have like had a shitty thing happen to me, but
Mm-hmm.
like, and so I guess it's a question of definitions. Like, do you
Yeah.
consider like what do you consider cancellation to be?
So yeah, for me, that's because like everyone has a different definition of cancellation and what cancel culture is because it's so different for everybody. But for me, what it is accountability for your actions and a consequence for your actions. Because what this should do for folks, seeing other folks be canceled for these terrible things, and you are someone who likes to do terrible things. Maybe this is a sign to say to you, stop. This can happen to you. And maybe that can be enough for you to say, you know what, I'm going to change who I am. I don't know if that actually happens. I don't know if there's someone out there who may have been an abuser one day and saw that, oh my God, I can't do this because look, I'm going to lose my internet career or my job or my Twitch partner status, and they want to stop now, or they haven't even started. Then that's a good thing. I think we've just protected a survivor and future people that from becoming, abused. But there's no way of quantifying that. There's no way of knowing that that's going to happen. So in my eyes, cancel culture is making people held accountable, consequences being done to them so that people in the future or people who are watching this can stop doing shitty behavior. Because if you see people getting away with it, if you're someone from the outside looking in at someone doing something horrible and they're getting away with it, it's more of an incentive for you to then do it because you're not going to be held accountable. But if we put these people hold them to accountability, and there's consequences for what happens. And I'm not talking about legal consequences. I don't know about that, but
Mm-hmm.
social consequences, uh, many financial consequences, then it may prevent someone in the future or someone seeing that from doing that type of shitty behavior, and it may protect somebody out there. It may save someone.
So, I mean, one of the things that I wonder about, or not even wonder about, but like one of the things that like if we're going to operate off of that definition of cancellation, like one of the
Mm-hmm.
things that does actually concern me about cancel culture then is, okay, so we are going to hold people accountable for things that are based off like what, like you know verbal or written accounts, and like we talked about earlier, when we were talking about sexual misconduct, that like you can believe a survivor, but you can also think that like people are innocent until proven guilty. But that kind of takes that power away from that second idea, because if we're going to be, deleting, like canceling people off of Twitch,
Mm-hmm.
just as an example, they're going to lose their partnership, they're going to lose their money, they're going to lose their job, they're going to like do whatever. Um, one thing that I think about cancellation, as I, define it, is that like generally there are power structures in place to protect these people, even if they lose, their life, their primary careers and stuff like that. But like that's
Mm-hmm.
not true on Twitch. And so I think it's a unique situation, and I don't know like what the answer is, because we also talked about how in certain situations, if the platform is not going to take an action, all we can do is raise our voices and try to either demand that the platform take an action, demand that their corporate, sponsors and partners take action, or directly, defund them. But like I think it's an interesting dynamic when it comes in particular to Twitch, because we have so much power over um like the directly funding these people, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I just
I
think.
think that I also think that I think that abusers will support fellow abusers. And, you know, we, you and we live in a bubble where our timelines are filled with this stuff because this is stuff we care about and it follows our ethos. There are people out there that live in a bubble that don't, a large contingency of the viewership on Twitch, they live in a bubble where they don't see this on their timeline. They don't want to see this on their timeline, and they don't care about it because they are, you know, just want to be here for the games. And so, because they don't care, because they're not, I would say politically charged, because this is a political thing in a way. It's not like
Mhm.
literal politics, but it's a political thing. They're, as much as like they're still going to support these people, which sucks. And sure, we can cancel the person and they lose their partner status and whatever that means, because then they can just probably go offline and go work, become a manager somewhere and still make money. It's not the end of the world. But the people that are watching them, it's like those are the people that I want to like get to, so that we can change their mindset and hopefully they can see that as well and not be supportive of this like disgusting culture.
Right. I mean, and I guess the idea, one of the other things is that, like, sure, there's going to be some disruption, right? Like, if you lose your partnership, if you are dropped by sponsors, like stuff like that, there's obviously going to be a disruption to your income. But like,
Hmm.
I think you bring up a good point that there is, while there's not any sort of like formal structured safety net for these people, like there are people who are still going to support them because
Yeah,
they like their gaming content and they're going to watch them no matter what. And so like they might just move on over to YouTube or something like that. And like
100%.
and they're still going to be fine. Where I think that the definition of cancel culture that we're working with has, bigger consequences, is for like medium to small size streamers. And that like if for some reason something happens and it turns out that like let's just say that it turns out somebody did make something up, right? Like that's it for them. Like they have no sort of support system. And so I can agree that cancel culture can be dangerous to people who don't wield a lot of social power,
Hmm.
especially on a social media platform. But like the hand wringing that I am seeing from people on Twitter about like, oh, we can't cancel X, Y, and Z, like they, look at, they're gonna lose their entire career. Like the people that are being held accountable right now are not, like, they will be okay.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
they'll be okay.
Hmm.
What these like what it says to me is it's a deep-seated insecurity of like, what if I get canceled? Like what's going to happen to me?
Hmm.
And like don't worry about it because like just don't, well, first of all, just don't do something shitty and you won't get canceled. And second, like you don't have, I made a tweet and it was like probably a like a mean take, but like a lot of the girls on Twitter, not girls, people on Twitter, I just call everybody that. A lot of the people on Twitter were
Y'all go
like,
to Blind Justice Twitter. She's a mess. She's a
she is a
mess.
mess. A lot of the people on Twitter were like, they're sitting there worrying about getting canceled for like defending these people, who are who have been accused of sexual misconduct. And they're like,
Mhm.
well, I might get canceled for this, but I'm gonna stick up for my favorite streamer, like whatever. Like, I am sorry, but you are not gonna get canceled. You simply aren't relevant enough to be canceled. Like, even working off our definition of cancellation, like, you don't have enough social capital for people to want to cancel you. So like, at the end of the day, I still, even working off this definition of cancellation, like, I don't think, like, it's real and it's a thing and it can have harm, but like, I don't think that we need to be worrying about canceling big streamers who have done shitty things simply because what, like, the off chance that like maybe this stuff isn't true. Like, I
Yeah.
just don't think it's a thing. And I think that goes hand in hand with what you talked about earlier about like what happens when we don't believe people. And like the trauma that that can induce and
Yeah.
the mental harm that that can cause. Like, it goes hand in hand. Like, we can't sit and hand wring about cancellation, and use that as our basis for not believing people, because they're
Yeah.
just not the same.
Yeah. I think you're exactly right. Like, are we more worried about the person getting canceled losing their income, or are we more worried about the person who's been attacked and has to live in trauma now? Who is of more value? Who's like, it's hard to quantify that, you know what I mean? But I will
Yeah.
say this, you can come back from being canceled. You know what you can do? You can become a better person. You can start, if you said the N-word and you really feel remorse towards that, then you should start really being an advocate and an ally to the Black community more than just putting out a statement. You should be in charities. You should be behind the scenes offline, going to specific communities, and they should know that you've been a bad person, so they're not like willingly accepting pieces of like trash into their establishments, but like going to be like, I would love to volunteer for this coalition. I want to be here. Should we go to the marches? Put your money where your mouth is, number one, and then actually do it. You know what I mean? If you're like, and sometimes, and I'm not like, I can't talk about like legal, if you were like, you're a rapist and you went to jail, like, how are you going to change your life? That's not my thing to take. But like, you can't come back from cancellation. Like, so this fear of like, but you can't come back from being abused. Like, you can come out of it stronger and you can try to like get through it, but it's always going to have been there. You can come back from cancellation and just be back to a person and make money again, and there you go. So I see that they're, like this idea of like, well, now they're canceled, they're forever dead. It's like, no, they can actually come back from that by just being a great person. And actually, if they truly believe that they've changed and they are truly a better person, then act better and you'll be better and you'll be probably accepted. At least in my view, at least in my world. And I know there are people that disagree. You can get redemption. If you were someone who said a slur in the homophobic community or in the LGBTQ plus community and you said a slur, I'm going to be mad at you and I'm going to hold you accountable and I want there to be consequences. But that doesn't mean that you will never be able to redeem yourself in my eyes. And that's just me. Some people don't need to accept your apology and I don't want to accept your apology either, but I want to see you do something about it. The people that you've affected and the systemic discrimination that you're perpetuating, that's more detrimental to human beings than you being canceled for like a month and then coming back, or like trying to show retribution and like actually go to chair, like do stuff to be a better human being. Like, there are ways for you to come back from that. It's so much harder for someone to come to fight systemic oppression or abuse and all of that. Do you know what I mean? So they're it's like apples and oranges.
No, I completely agree. And like, I think that's a really good point. Like, the tea is this: you don't even have to be a good person to come back from cancellation. You can continue
Sure.
to engage in your shitty behavior. We've seen, like, it happens. Like, it happens. People are
Mhm.
incredibly resilient to cancellation. Now, like I said, like we were talking about earlier, like, I think that Twitch is a slightly like unique situation, but like, even then, you can come back from cancellation. Like, let's say that
The
you
bans are like 30 days. You can come back. You said the N-word. Okay, you're banned for 30 days. Now you're back.
right, and
Like,
even if it's a permanent ban, that is what it is. But like, let's say that like Twitch doesn't do anything because you don't come forward and you're not going to admit that you've done something wrong, and Twitch has made the decision that we're not going to like punish people like that. Let's say you get canceled and like we we convince everybody to pull your sponsorships. We like do whatever. We try to delete or to convince a bunch of your subs to leave. Your viewer count goes down, like all of that. Let's say that happens. Okay, you'll be fine. Like you will come back. Like you will come. They will come back from that. Like they will come back from that. They will get new sponsors once people unfortunately forget that all of this happened. Like our especially on the internet, our cultural memory is extremely short, and so
Yeah.
like
Our
you can
attention
come
span is
back from
constantly
it.
being stimulated by like, oh, now this person said this, now this person killed this person, now this person. It's like, you're right.
And I think that like you make a really good point. Like people come back from cancellation all the time, but like what people can't do is undo um being abused and undo being assaulted, undo experiencing these horrible things.
Undo systemic oppression, undo rights being stripped from you,
Yeah. I mean, and so this all like the point of
undo suicides because people are being verbally harassed because of who they are and the color of their skin.
right, or because of the person that they are in love with, or because of the gender that they are, like it it happens all the time. And so I think like the point I'm trying to make in talking about this, and it seems like you agree, is that like worrying about canceling and worrying about like your favorite streamer getting canceled without adequate evidence, like that should not be part of the calculus that you have when you are trying to decide, should I believe what the survivors are telling me, or should I be more worried about my favorite streamer getting canceled? Don't worry about that. Like that's not the magnitudes of harm that that could happen from you not believing a survivor are much greater than if your favorite streamer gets canceled. Like,
yeah, 100%.
I just think so. And I think that historically that is true.
And by the way, I think that type of response isn't as altruistic as they want people to think. I think it's a response of like, well, I'm not going to be able to see these great plays anymore. Newsflash, there are millions of content creators out there. You'll find someone to do the same thing. So find someone who does it just as well, but also is a great person. Right. So like this whole idea of you being altruistic, be like, I don't want them to be canceled. They don't deserve that because they're so like, we need to protect our people. The jury's still out on if altruism is actually a real thing in the human world. Just to be honest, it's a really big deal. So like, you'll find another content creator who does the same thing, but is actually a good person. So they exist. They're out there.
I agree. And that's a really good point. Like
the whole thing, just to touch, like to pin a point on that, it's nefarious. It's very nefarious when people come out and try to defend cancellation or go against like we shouldn't cancel people, because it's not like it seemingly is altruistic, but it actually may not be.
Right. And no, I think that's completely true. And like I said, I think it's like stems from a fear that like maybe one day I'll get canceled. And it's like it's kind of, it reminds me, it's an imperfect analogy, but it reminds me of that like old saying that like everybody in America, at least, and this probably isn't true of like Canada, but like nobody in America is poor. We're just like temporarily embarrassed billionaires, right? So like it's like that. It's like I think that what people worry about is like we can't cancel this person because what if someday I'm in a position to get canceled? And it's like, homegirl, probably not, A, and B, like if you are in a position where like you could truly be canceled because like you wield enough social status and like you have enough clout, like maybe don't do shitty things. Like it's a pretty easy solution.
Number two, if you are in a position that you have a lot of social clout and you're a big influencer, you're higher on that totem pole and you do get canceled, actually there might not be anything that really happens. You're probably gonna come back from it.
Right.
So it's an irrational fear.
It's just something that I see so often that like I feel like it's worth talking about like on its own, because every Tom, Dick, and Harry on Twitch is like, or not on Twitch, on Twitter is like, what is like hand wringing about it in the comments. It's just like that's not it. Like that's not it.
Like what's the point of you going into someone's tweet that they just said that they've been abused and you say, I don't really believe you? What's the point of that? What's the point? What is the point if none of those points are what Blind Justice and I are talking about? That either you have an irrational fear of being canceled, you've done it yourself, or you one day believe that that could somehow happen to you, and if you do get to that status, well, you're going to bounce back anyways. Those are the three options, boo. You're not actually as altruistic as you're making it out to seem.
Right. And like, even, I mean, there's just no need for you to like white knight for these people, right? Like, they don't need you to do that. They don't need you to do that. They have every ability. Some of them have fucking PR teams and shit like that. Like, they have every ability to make their own statement and defend their own case. Like, you do not need to do that for them.
Yeah.
Which is like another thing that I feel like needs to be said. Like, what are you gaining from white knighting for these people? Nothing, except
Nothing.
looking like an asshole
Yeah.
online.
Yeah, literally. And it's like, I always say this, you're entitled to your opinion and you can talk about it, but you're not entitled to actually having people listen to it, and you're not entitled to it actually having any sort of validity.
Yeah, and you're not entitled to people coming back on you for it or arguing with you about it, because like, the conservatives love that marketplace of ideas, mama, and you just threw yourself right into it. So
Mm,
I think that is what it is.
yeah.
Um, well, thank you for talking with me about this too. I really appreciate the insight of, another person who is kind of ingrained in Twitch culture and or streamer Twitter, which is like insane. It's like an insane place.
Yeah.
But I appreciate your thoughts. And uh, and yeah, do you have any other insights that you want to share about this topic?
Well, first, thank you so much for having me. I mean, I'm happy to talk about this. I think my final point is I personally don't have a fear of being canceled. And the reason that is because I feel in my heart of hearts that I am not, my morals, I can die on my hill of morals because, I believe in so many positive, beautiful things. And I'm not afraid that someone will come out and say, Sammy did this, because I didn't. And like, I'm not afraid of that. And so that irrational fear, if you do have that irrational fear out there, look inwards. Is it because you maybe aren't the most perfect human being? Which is fair. We're not all perfect. But look at that and dissect that. Be like, have I been a piece of shit sometimes? And when I have, what have I done? And if you can pinpoint those things and you're able to make amends and apologize for what you've done, go do it. Because then that dirty laundry will never be aired because you've resolved it.
Mm-hmm.
If you've truly resolved it. And on the other hand, if you do have this irrational fear just because it's irrational, also break that down. Don't have an irrational, like, it's so hard to say don't have an irrational fear, because I have an irrational fear of many things. But like, if you can be aware of that, then the fear, that fear or whatever you're white knighting for becomes less relevant, and you can actually live your life
Right.
and still continue being a person. So like, just really look inwards. Oftentimes, a lot. It's really hard to do it, but you just got it sometimes.
And that, I mean, and if you do that, it will, maybe you'll be able to convince yourself, maybe I don't need to like reply to the survivor's tweet telling their story saying maybe I don't believe you. Like, maybe if you recognize these things, you will not do that. Like,
Yeah.
and maybe, um like I said, at the beginning of this video, like, I want to equip our, people who are on our side, quote unquote, like, to be able to talk about these things. So like, hopefully this has given you something to think about. Because like, I think it is our responsibility to try to, like, I don't want to put the emotional labor on survivors to try to defend themselves and to try to, respond to these people. Like, if I can do that for them in an intelligent way, like, they shouldn't have to do it. Now, that doesn't mean like blowing up their mentions over it, but like, at the same time, like, you can, you should feel, I would hope that you can like feel comfortable engaging with somebody if you are in a space that you feel like you can do that. Because like, I feel like we should, because I feel
Yeah.
like we need to, it's important for us to do that.
I concur.
Well, thank you, Sammy.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we love seeing you here. So, I know this video has been incredibly long, but I want to appreciate all of you who have stuck through it to the end. I really want to thank everybody who has been willing to share their thoughts with me, who has been willing to be interviewed, who wrote to me, and offered to give me some insights. I really, really appreciate it. Like I said, I wanted to educate myself, but I also wanted to educate you. So I really hope you guys got something out of it. Um, I hope that you feel equipped. I hope you feel comfortable engaging with people online, because now is not the time to remain on the sidelines. Um, but before you do that, I do want to, throw out a word of caution. As you heard, it is re-traumatizing every time to have to relive their story, to have to be constantly bombarded and thinking about this. So while I encourage you to engage with people, if you think you can change somebody's mind, um, don't blow up survivors mentions over it, because that's the last thing that they need. But I hope that you feel and understand why it's so important to be compassionate in a time like this, why it's so important to listen to survivors, and why the consequences and feelings of the accused should not be taking center stage right now. Um, we are at a point where we can choose to stand on the right side of things that are happening, stand on the right side of history as these kind of cultural watersheds continue to happen. And so I hope that you are comfortable doing that, and I implore you to do it. Um, as I said, thank you so much to everybody who helped me learn and educate, and have a great night or day wherever you are. Um, and just please continue to be the lovely people that I know everybody in my community is, and that I like to believe that most of you out there are. So until then, um, please just listen. Please just believe survivors, um, and understand how important it is for you to do that.